Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, degenerate socialist egalitarians who aren't trying to maximise for private property rights and intolerance. Democracy, the God That Failed is a temperately titled book written by the German-born economist Hans-Herman Hoppe and published in 2001. Hoppe is an economist of the Austrian School, and he takes his love of absolutely uninfringible private property rights as a starting point and really pushes his concept about as far as it will possibly go. All states are bad, but monarchies are much better than democracies. Egalitarianism is civilizational acid. State-administered immigration is forced integration. Taxation is naturally theft. Defence should be privatised, and so much more. For this episode, Gabe from Tukey's Mag Sidebar podcast escaped his handlers and found his way onto our podcast. Finding his companionship mostly agreeable, we allowed him to join us in our journey to the most rightward expanses of Ancapistan. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, you can hear upcoming episodes early, and we have weekly voice chats with our subscribers. I've also published a novel called Tower, the first few chapters of which are available for free on my Substack, the link to which is in the show notes. We also have a Discord server for this podcast on which you can find Levi, me, and plenty of other degenerates who listen to the Book Club from Hell, the link to which is once again in the show notes. Also, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate us on your podcast app of choice, like our videos on YouTube, etc. In short, feed the algorithm, help it to like us, these things really help. Finally, everybody should check out the Tukey's Mag Substack page as well as their Sidebar podcast. The links to both of these things are in the show notes. So if you're ready to form gated communities of optimised individuals defended by ruthlessly value-driven insurance companies, then listen on. Enjoy.
So welcome to our guest.
Welcome to our guest, Gabe.
From Tukey's Sidebar and Tukey's Mag.
He's escaped his handlers.
He's escaped
Captain
David. Yeah.
He's gone rogue.
How's it feel to be free?
They're searching for him with tranquilizer rifles and a Hessian sack.
Yes, I've broken containment. I am Gabriel Kimball Sinclair, the incel extraordinaire, and I have I've escaped capitalism's tyranny, or capitalismo's tyranny. I'm now free amongst my true libertarian brothers, away from the National Socialist state of Tukey's Mag and the tyranny of the Dietic Dave. I've embraced my true calling.
So today, this week we've read Democracy, the God That Failed, by Hans-Herman Hoppe, who is probably by most people's standards obscure, but within the Austrian economics tradition and to some degree within the Bitcoin community is reasonably well known and fairly respected.
And I'd say he's probably the world's most confident economist. This is an extremely confident book.
Yeah.
The confidence on display here, his praxeological confidence is unrivaled. There is not the slightest hint in this book. There's not a single word that expresses any doubt that that he is not right about everything all the time.
And as I think this episode will come out after Fiat Food. So we've just recently, Jack and I recorded an episode on Fiat Food by Matthew Lysiak, which is a book about Bitcoin and inflation and our diet and health, especially Americans. Very fun episode, very long episode, bit of a monster episode. I was happy to hear that for this particular book, we were having a guest on to talk about it. I think that was really good. It turns out Gabe's actually read it before, so that's really cool. Before we jump into it, Gabe, did you want to give us a bit of background about what you do and share, and like have a bit of a shill moment for any projects and stuff that you're working on?
Well, before my virtuous selfish shilling, I would like to, since we're talking about monarchy and land ownership, I would like to actually start this off with a land acknowledgement to the indigenous community that 1/3 of this podcast is currently recording from, actually. I know for a fact that one of the people here is recording from the occupied Habsburg lands of Prague. So this shilling is dedicated to loving memory of Franz Joseph, We're so sorry we failed you. You're always your second strongest soldier.
The Battle of the White Mountain was in fact glorious. 1620 was a glorious year. I'll be crucified in Prague for saying that out loud.
I in fact once there's I don't know if it's still live, but there's a website, an online community called Australian Royalty, which is a website dedicated to people who are direct descendants of convicts and like the First Fleet in particular, and yeah, they were like regard themselves as like quote unquote Australian royalty, and I found it really funny when
we know the only true Australian royalty is Ziz.
Yeah,
Ziz and Chessborough.
So thank you for your acknowledgement, pledge of allegiance, and so forth, Gabe. Much appreciated.
All right, but now that my adoration for Franz Joseph aside, is I'm Gabe Sinclair. I'm 1/3 of the Tookie's Mad podcast, mostly known for the sidebar, and from time to time, like to grab into my own grab bag of my own podcast where I interview people from the E-Right and people who are independently publishing literature. I've been a fan of y'all for a long time, actually, a really long time, and I'm really glad that me suggesting to Eric's Han to go on y'all's show was basically what led to this. So it's a beautiful meeting of the minds here. I'm glad I could get a settlement between the Hellions and the top tuggers, before they start killing each other.
Yeah, trying to end this sectarian war. I don't know if it can be a top-down phenomena, though. I feel like the people have to choose peace. Yeah, cool. So is there a particular first episode of the Sidebar, which is the podcast, or a particular article, which is the mag, that you would say like is a good first article or podcast to check out for our listeners that you would suggest?
For y'all's interest, anything written by Dave is actually really good. His Substack is really, really good. As soon as I saw his Substack, I knew actually, oh man, this is a really interesting guy. That's how I got in contact with him. I can't remember the name, but I highly recommend, the petroleum economy, how, our relationships to petroleum and natural resources affect how we live in politics and so forth. In regards to our first episode, our first banger episode is obviously Nutcranker. If you want a thorough, spontaneous birth of our pod, I definitely would say Nutcranker. Nutcranker's a really good one. Another episode, our recent episode Shadouk was actually pretty funny as well. In terms of if you're more into the edgy stuff, if you're more into the E-Right stuff, Hate Spree was amusing. It was definitely amusing to a certain degree. Incel, and I think we almost done 20 episodes. It's so weird. You actually do lose track as soon as you get past the double-digit marks, actually.
Yeah, you've got 32 episodes live at the moment.
Wow. Man, actually, I'm over 32. Wow. Man, in that case, we've read a lot of bad ones. I've forgotten. No. Yeah. Another great one is with a foundational tugger is Give Up the Ghost. That one was a fantastic book in a lot of ways, and it's with our father, Miles McNaughton, who, if it was not for Miles and Unreal Press, shout out to Unreal Press and the Tales of the Unreal. If it was not for the Unreal Press, we would not have a Tookie Sidebar, and y'all would not have the gift of Gabe here today.
Your episode with Catherine D was really good as well.
Oh, that was a fantastic.
Yeah, that one, and shout out to Catherine D too.
That was one of my most Hoppian.
The ficto sexuality. Your Gorak episode was really good,
and is our most controversial episode by far.
So should we jump into it?
Yeah.
So the book that we've read, Democracy: The God That Failed, at a high level, before we get into our expectations and stuff with the book, is essentially Hans-Hermann Hoppe's collection of criticisms of democracy, of modern democracy, and how it violates lots of libertarian principles such as private property, and in some parts actively argues for positive solutions to this problem, including things like secession or like the superiority of monarchy over democracy and that sort of stuff. Although he's got a very specific meaning what he means by monarchy and democracy, so forth, that we'll get into. But that's the high level synopsis, and it was a really interesting book. So yeah, what was
so
your
much fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. What were your expectations going in, Jack?
So my expectations were that I'd basically heard of Hoppe as, he's that libertarian monarchist guy. And that I hadn't heard too much more about him than that. Having read the book, that's not really what's going on. I think his basic thesis is effectively every state is illegitimate and terrible. But if you have to choose a state, if you have to choose a mafia criminal organization to stand over you and take your stuff while charging you for protection, it's better that it's a monarchy than a democracy. Which he spends 200 pages saying that and more. So those were more or less my expectations going in. I did know that he'd been referenced by and was liked by Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin and other people in that sphere, and I'm sure Gabe will talk about that more. So when I was reading a lot of these things, I was already somewhat familiar with them, but it was fun reading them in such a pure form. He writes very, very clearly, very, very systematically, and reasons in such a way that he has a handful of first principles and just pushes them as far as they can possibly go to breaking point, which made this book really, really enjoyable. This is such a fun book. Those are my expectations. I didn't have too many expectations. Beyond Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin, and the book has a funny title.
Well, it's a very memeable title. You know what I mean? It's
extremely.
It's like I don't. Y'all said this with Evola. I mean, with Pegasus, you said with Evola was a banger. Like he would make so much money as a.
His name's Matt. His name is not Matt Pegasus. You did this in your episode on Tukey's Mag where you were talking about his books as well.
Well, it's a Straussian reference to how majestic I find him. You know, he soars to the sun effortlessly. You know, any people who try to fall off his back, and as the only person of the three who actually really liked Black Album, I have earned the right to use Pegasus. It's a great. I really liked the essays. Were really good. But on the point of Hoppe, you know, when I first read this, you know, I was starting to get into, you know, capital P politics. You know, politics was no longer what my grandpa watched Bill O'Reilly and the, you know, old school TV with the 3 plugs in the back and all these things. Politics became real, you know, during the early Gamergate era, 2014, 2015, 2016. And, you know, you read this and it's so pure and unadulterated. You know, it's going straight into like, you know, you haven't even sipped a sip of alcohol. You're going straight into like cocaine, you know, in a lot of ways.
Yeah. This is going straight to IV drugs.
Yeah, no, for real. Honestly, it's so visceral and so in your face, and it's unlike anything you've ever read before. And it really opens up so many branches. Like the Overton window, like the classic political compass is just shattered. You're just because it's like roots, like it's a central root of a many branched tree that goes in so many different ways, and that's why you see so many communities talk about Hans-Hermann Hoppe, is that in a lot of ways, fundamentally, I had expectations when I first read this book, is like, oh, you know, it's edgy. Oh, democracy, the god that failed. You know, it was the early edgy era of the internet. And, you know, and you just get hit with this, and you're getting hit with this idea of true freedom and freedom versus the reality of being under a state. What does it mean? What is a state? And you have this ideas of what my expectations were now, you know, a sense of nostalgia, and you're really like, oh man, you know, all these ideas that I've grown up with in a lot of ways come from this source. You know, it's the idea of all Abrahamic myths come from the old, that's why when we were talking about this before recording, I said this is, you know, in a lot of ways, the online politics like Old Testament. It's at least part of the Old Testament canon of the internet generation of politics.
Yeah,
honestly. Yeah. Like the internet proliferation of like political radicalization would not happen if it wasn't for some degree of Hoppe. Hoppe as an internet figure really, really looms over online politics.
And so when did you first read the book, Gabe?
I want to say 17.
Yeah, right. That's an interesting book to be reading at 17. Nice.
Well, yeah, you know what? I was starting to really get into these kind of things. You know, during the Trump era, there was no option of exit. There was no option to say no to politics at that time. You know, and when I had a very much a Socratic childhood. You know, my mother, allowed me to have any opinion I had. She was very much a very pro using your own brain, thinking on your own, that kind of thing. An accidental aristocrat. Homeschooled, much like yeah. Much like Pegasus.
Homeschooled aristocrat. Shout out to whoever taught you.
My mother has the virtues of a saint. She kept me contained in the world as long as she could. Before I was unleashed. But
Gabe has discovered Hans-Herman Hoppe.
Society is now destroyed. I have come to, with a sword in hand to destroy the longhouse of the state and the welfare state now.
I guess it's 17 years old is normally the prime Ayn Rand period. And so you've basically, you've seen that trajectory, but just gone to its furthest extent. You've blown way past Ayn Rand.
No, I had it bad. I'll give y'all a little secret. It's going to be so cringe for your listeners, but I was actually a Jordan Peterson kid. I actually did really like Jordan Peterson. And it was through Peterson that I got introduced to Nietzsche. And that's when I started reading I was a big reader, but big boy books. So I still have the compendium of all of Nietzsche's books. I have it to this day. Nietzsche, of course, blew my mind. And initially, that's what I got into, I am the Ubermensch, fuck around. I mean, the very low resolution reading of Nietzsche.
Reading Beyond Good and Evil. It's this is me. This is basically me.
Yes, it was my Ryan Gosling Litter to Me era. Was Nietzsche. Reading the first 5 pages of Beyond Good and Evil and thinking I understood it all. You know what I mean? I was very much that kid. So I live up to my stereotypes, hopefully.
Nice.
Levi, what were your expectations? And then maybe we'll circle back to Gabe and he can tell us the relevance of this to the online right today, why it's an Old Testament text.
My expectations were that it was going to be wacky and silly, and I didn't. And I guess it was a bit out there, but I wouldn't say it was silly. And I'd say it's actually a really well-written book. But my expectations were, I can't remember if I finished the book or if I just read some chapters of it. But he has another book called The Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, or A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, which I really liked, and I found it really compelling, and I feel like it's had a big impact on my thinking. And yeah, so I guess I was already positively inclined towards him. However, I also, as listeners of the podcast would know, I tend to err on the side of, despite its flaws that need to be fixed within each particular jurisdiction, democracy is a fairly safe bet at this point in history that, you'd rather live in a democratic country than a non-democratic country. So, and a lot of that thinking comes from, in particular, Popper, Karl Popper. So it was good to read. I was thinking, okay, well, a lot of Bitcoiners and stuff say this book is really worth reading, so I'll go into it with an open mind and see if because basically all the other anti-democratic books that we've read, or books that have anti-democratic elements in them, I've found them to be really weak. And I was like, okay, let's give this one a shot, see what he actually says, and if there's something here worth considering. Yeah, so kind of a bit of a mixed bag, I suppose. Guardedly looking forward to it, I'd say.
I do have a question for Levi. Would you still, since you're more well read in libertarian theory, or at least some aspects of Austrian thought, would you still, because Hoppe in a lot of areas of libertarianism, the reason types, what Rothbard used to call the modal libertarians, would you still consider Hoppe a libertarian, or does he take too many steps towards the right that you would say he's no longer tethered to the concept of libertarianism?
I guess it depends what you mean by libertarian. I don't know if I have enough resolution in my mind of what are the different ways that word could be used, and the distinctions between different schools and then subcultures and stuff. To me, he seems like somebody who has taken some first principles to their logical extreme, which, as he mentions in one of the chapters, means that there's certain types of libertarians that he really dislikes, like libertarian communists, as he calls them, and stuff. And there's other types of libertarians, which are basically like the ones who are, like want to protect, like private property and free exchange and that sort of stuff. It just seems like he's just taking that to the extreme. So I suppose, I'd say he's a libertarian, but he's an extremely, I suppose, ideologically pure form of libertarianism. I suppose he's like triple A grade cocaine libertarianism.
This is beyond 100% purity.
Or maybe not libertarian. I don't know. Like, what's the other word? Like anarcho-capitalism, or pure capitalism, or was the other term is like a free law or something like that. Like
he calls them. Yeah, he talks about private law societies.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, which I suppose is just given that like the mix of people that could call themselves a libertarian is useful to like distinguish him from other libertarians. Is like just say, oh yeah, he's anarcho-capitalist. Is maybe
he
worthwhile,
does to some extent answer this question though in this book, where he says, okay, well, what is liberalism? Liberalism is private property. That's what it is, and I like private property.
Yeah, so maybe he's just a liberal. Yeah. So
he's a classical liberal. He's a classical liberal.
He's a classical liberal that has the hindsight of seeing the destruction of modern democracy. The other liberals, including Ron Mises, didn't get to see how it played out historically, and now he, standing on the shoulders of giants, like, actually, you know what? For the purposes of private property, this whole democracy thing, nah.
So today, when people say in public that they're classical liberals, what they really mean is that they've read and loved Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans-Hermann Hoppe, and stand by all of the conclusions he draws in this book.
Yeah, it's a Straussian dog whistle every time you hear it.
They're just dog whistling that they want insurance companies to control defense.
So, Gabe, did you want to talk to a little bit about its relevance to things like NRX and the online right and so forth?
Well, Hoppe is definitely very much, a mentor to Curtis Yarvin, or more popularly known as Mencious Moldbug, very much the Palpatine to his Anakin Skywalker, because the main, Hoppe will nominally say, I'm not for monarchy. I'm not saying I would like a monarchy. I'm just saying it's better than democracy. And you could see like teenage Curtis Yarvin. He's like, wait a minute. A king is just a private owner, like they own the assets. And the people on that land are his assets, like serfs. And then you could see his gears spinning in his techno Silicon Valley mid-90s brain, right? And that's how he got the
neo-cameralist gears started turning in his brain.
Yes, and you could see Hoppe. It's like, listen, Yarvin, I'm not saying it is a good thing. You can see like the little dark age edits, like a thought bubble Yarvin's brain. So he's just imagining all these cool techno Frederick the Great tier, like patchwork kingdoms and all the like Bit Zion, like his very famous piece of like turning Bitcoin into an actual status. The opposite of Bitcoin is like a Bitcoin state. So, without Hoppe, we would not get half of the internet, politics as it is. Hoppe is very much, as I said earlier, an Old Testament figure in a lot of senses. Right before Trump, the famous moment where, much like Zarathustra coming down the mountain, he comes down the escalators. 2014, 2015, there's books, your favorite book, everyone's favorite recommendation, Siege, was all everywhere. Siege, Revolt Against the Modern World, and of course, Democracy, the God That Failed. And the reason why Democracy, God That Failed is what we call like a starter pack text, or if you want someone to get into, or it really is, because the main three
5-year-olds.
I might as well have been 5 when I first read it, so maybe, but because when you read this, when you see the most reactionary forms of right-wing politics, tradcasts, identitarians, or hardcore techno-libertarians, or hardcore accelerationists like Nick Land, to use the red pill metaphor, you take the pill, which is Democracy God That Failed, and like a candy rock, like a pop rock, you feel it sizzle on your tongue, and it's a total palate cleanser. It really is, because you get exposed to these 3 different branches who are technically incompatible, but within this text, it's like a pathway to multiple spheres of these ideas. Somehow, Hoppe managed to weave like little bits and nuggets and pieces of thought of Catholic monarchy, as he references classical Catholic thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, Bertrand de Jouvenel, so forth throughout the text. He references Paul Gottfried, Buchanan, John Raspiel I forget the name of the book. It's the
is that Jean Raspail? Camp of the Saints?
Camp of the Saints. He references that. He sprinkles all these hyper reactionary treats throughout the text, and using Democracy to Godfield as a base point, you can go anywhere. I mean, in terms of sheer influence, Democracy to God That Failed it's the libertarianism it gives it a sense of safety. Libertarianism, and I don't want to give credence to this idea of like, libertarianisms are just right wingers who are afraid to call themselves right wingers, But in a sense, the fact that he is so rigid in his a priori beliefs and he's so thorough in his beliefs, he will. It's clear as day he has cultural biases. I think it's very hard to deny Hoppe has cultural biases, but his sincere
they're on display. Like he's not trying to hide them either.
Yeah, but he values his libertarian priors so much that in a lot of ways he will actually put his libertarian priors before those biases. So as a side effect, he gives such intellectual vigor to the justification of these prior biases through his rigor and his justification in libertarianism. And so it was that sheer unique flavoring, because no one's going to be convinced by a French reactionary in 1820 justifying Louis XVIII as Sun King. We just simply don't have the language. We don't have what Wittgenstein would say, a family resemblance of symbols. I mean, what they're referring to would be like speaking a different language. Even if it was translated fully into English, it wouldn't. Their criteria of justifying monarchy would not work. Even when Moldbug in one of his essays recommends, Robert Filmer of the Patriarcha fame, who called Thomas Hobbes a libtard, basically. He has to use very
the original libtard
language.
Thomas Hobbes.
Technically a fall in liberalism.
It's less ridiculous a statement than it first seems.
Yeah, Robert Filmer, actually, there's this great collection of letters between Robert Filmer and Hobbes, and he says something along the lines, I love the house you built, I just hate its foundations. Because, Hobbes used rationality and enlightenment kind of priors to justify monarchy, when Robert Filmer is basically, I love my king, simple as, that kind of thing. The kings rule because they rule. And, if without this sense of a prior just acceptance of the king as an embodiment of the heaven and holy on earth, chaos will spread. And there's a sense of psychological safety because he knows it's irrational. But what Filmer is saying is that despite this irrationality, the rational is safe in contrast to rationality, which can lead to justifications of total chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Right.
Yeah, so with Hobbes is that he's, to quote, everyone's favorite Spangler. I know this is a Spangler podcast. We're all Spangler males here. In a lot of ways, I would say Spangler would critique Hoppe, and you'd say, he's using the English. This book is written in the ink of an Englishman's accountant book, basically, because he uses purely economic terms to describe monarchy.
The German conservative revolutionaries would love Hoppe. No doubt,
absolutely.
They'd go bananas for this book.
No, absolutely. I mean, some would criticize. Junger would probably also criticize it as maybe too material.
I think all of them would hate it.
No, true. It absolutely. Well, Schmidt. I think Hoppe is actually very interesting to combine with Schmidt in a lot of ways because both of them. I think by instinct, Hoppe is actually kind of a statist to a certain degree. It's really hard seeing him trying to fight these obvious statist conclusions because he fundamentally, both him and Schmidt agree that violence is built into the human existence. That's his major a priori belief, is that violence is intrinsic to human nature. And that's the biggest contrast to libertarians. The idea of Rothbard said there was 3 different libertarians. You got the hippies who just want to smoke weed all day, basically. The preppies, the Koch brothers, Coca-Cola libertarians, and the rednecks. And he said that with actually pride and actually with a sense of parochial love. But with Hoppe is that he has this intrinsic love of libertarianism, but his natural instinct is a very right-wing instinct, is that, human beings are naturally violent, dumb, and chaotic, and we must fight our animalistic natures with rationality, with reason at all costs. That's why he says, the preservation of time preference is so important. And he says preservation of time preference is a biological phenomenon. It's not only like a holy imperative, it is a lived-in imperative, is the preservation of time preference at all costs. And that's where you get the conservative instinct and the libertarian instinct fused into one, basically, with Hoppe.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Yeah, nice. That's an interesting connection. We should definitely speak more about time preference in a tick. I think we, if people end up listening to Fiat Food, which was quite a long, we speak quite a bit about time preference, so we probably don't need to as much here, but for anybody who decides not to listen to that,
give it some intro, because it's a pretty straightforward idea.
Yeah. I guess, should I do like quick overview of like the Austrian stuff, or like?
Yeah, do that too, because this book is basically him taking a bunch of Austrian principles and pushing them really, really, really hard in a political context. And so if you understand the Austrian principles, this book is written systematically enough that, having read the first chapter of it, I felt like I could basically work out what he was going to say for the rest of the book, and I was right.
Yeah.
This book reaches some conclusions that I guess are extreme by the standards of our Overton window, but aren't frivolous, in that he's quite systematic in how he got there, and he shows you his working.
Yeah. That's fair. So at least, and like Gabe, feel free to hop in at any time. But like my 30,000 foot understanding of the Austrian school is essentially, it's a heterodox school of economics. So, you won't really find it taught, except maybe as like a side note, in any Western universities as what economics is. Maybe the only like mainstream thinker that like an economics grad will have like been exposed to in terms of Austrian economists would be what's the guy? I'm blanking.
Could be Hayek.
Hayek, yeah, be Hayek, who'd be like the most famous. And like there's a lot of differences between them and like mainstream economics, except probably like one of the key differences is that, like, I suppose the methodological approach, or what I think of as a mode of explanation. So like what I mean by that is, within each, say, domain of human understanding of the world, we have not just the explanations themselves, but like a mode of explanation. So for example, like in physics, in classical physics, you have like initial conditions and then dynamic laws of motion. And then given like the initial conditions and those dynamical laws, you can make predictions about like a system, at least a fairly simple system. So that's like the mode they're using is like this deterministic initial conditions relating to dynamical laws. Whereas like the mode of explanation within, say, like biology is like the relationship between variation and selection and how that creates diversity. There's not this like prediction. There's not this sense of like creating predictions and dynamical laws and stuff. It's like statistical. It's stochastic. It is talking about the production of new forms that haven't existed before and so forth. In the case of like economics, the mode of explanation that the Austrians propose is like called praxeology, which largely speaking is, I kind of think about it like geometry for economics, or geometry for human action being intentional, goal motivated, purposeful behavior, rather than like your elbow just like reacting to being hit on the edge of like a door or something. It's which would just feel like your body reacting in a kind of like instinctual sense, but actually higher executive function of making decisions, choosing goals, pursuing them, and so forth. There's like a logic to that, and they use essentially this very rigorous form of argumentation rather than mathematics to explore the consequences of certain what they call axioms about the nature of human action and what it means to be a person making decisions under resource constraints, versus mainstream economics, which is empirical and collectivist, where they are basically like taking statistical samples of things that are happening in society, or making mathematical theorems about things that happen at a collective level, whereas the Austrians are looking at things from an individual perspective, what they call like methodological individualism, and then all the higher level collective consequences of those are like, that's an emergent or spontaneous order as a consequence of all of the interactions between these individuals, operating under praxeological principles. And that's my high level understanding. I don't know if that's too high level for a reader to make any sense of. What do you reckon, Gabe? And do you want to add anything there? Hopefully that wasn't too...
No, that's an excellent. I mean, I'm still in awe of your beautiful, beautiful fiat rant with the fiat food. Yeah, I could definitely feel that $100 rotting in my pocket. I immediately need to insert that into Bitcoin purchases as we speak. I did not appreciate the Nixon slander, but because to be honest, it was mostly just leftover. 90% of the policies was just leftover paperwork from the FDR era.
Yes, fair enough.
I don't particularly like him either.
He continued the debasement.
Rothbard's in like burning hatred for FDR. You read his FDR work; it's an incredible thing. You can definitely see that Austrian teeth when Rothbard talks about FDR.
No doubt.
No, you're absolutely right in terms of actual judgment of the a priori. Because one of my favorite rants of yours, the ever vivacious Levi on cryptocurrency is one of my favorite aspects of the booklet from hell, is that you mentioned, I think it was a Patreon talk, you're talking about Karl Popper talking to a Marxist, or no, a Freudian. And the problem with Freudian logic is that they can justify anything. The whole point of Freudian ideology was that basically you can ask them anything. And the whole framework of Freudianism is that they can never be wrong. The whole point of Freudian framework is they never can be wrong. They can always ad hoc, post, basically retcon what they said 5 minutes ago using the framework of Freudianism, right? And
controlling the frame.
Yes, frame game. Yes, and another found. Hoppe definitely knew how to slay the ladies. He knows how to pass the shit test. That man has never failed a shit test in his life. But yeah, that's exactly right. Is that in terms of frame, in terms of asserting these things, you also made this joke a long time ago about Keynes. Keynes called it the science of monetary theory. I think that was the original title of the book. Scientific socialism. Marxism was 100% scientific. All these things.
Rational construction of society.
Right. Yeah, it's 100% rational. They use these loan terms, phrase laundering, to actually quote, I think actually, funny enough, Lenin himself, phrase laundering, all these things from the, look at what scientists gave you. Yeah, nice. Phrase laundering. They take these phrases, take these ideas, and like, oh, look, it's a chain of reaction. You get point A, point B. It's the history of you get slavery, and then you get slowly get emancipated until finally we get free from capitalism. It's systematic. Look, it has a list and everything, right? It's charlatanism, and the whole point of the radical libertarians like Hoppe, but he hates Hayek, by the way. His speech on Hayek is very.
He calls me socialist.
Yes, and Rothbard also hated Hayek too.
That's really interesting.
in a lot of ways, Hayek is the Menshevik to Rothbard and Hoppe's Bolsheviks. If you read the old essays from Lenin, the way he describes Mensheviks is exactly how Hoppe and Rothbard describe, the Koch brother libertarians or Cato Institute libertarians. It's the same idea in ironic enough Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, is that capitalism can absorb any criticism that you can critique it and sell it back to you. The problem with liberal democracy is the same thing what Karl Popper said with Freudianism, with the quote-unquote debate culture, marketplace ideas. The fact that it's a marketplace ideas is that it can absorb any criticism and sell it back to you and water down any criticism. Schmidt called this the endless conversation. You think, it takes too long to debate topics and we need immediate change now? Let's have a sit down and talk about it. And we'll enact 10% of this emergency action and we'll discuss about it some more. So if you need something 100% done now, you maybe get increments of 10% discussing it 90% of the time. You have 100% conversations when something that should be done immediately. The state of emergency, that classic state of exception thing with Schmidt. So with Hoppe, he prefers the concept of exit over voice, spatializing differences of disagreements. Because the problem with liberalism, or same thing with Popper's problem with Freudianism, is that you can't critique liberalism out of liberalism, because liberalism takes debate as a necessary prerequisite of liberalism, and no system can willfully kill itself. It can never self-delete, at least not willfully. So the problem with trying to work within the institutional liberalism from Hoppe or Rothbard's stance is that fundamentally is that you're just going to get absorbed into the system, and that eventually you're just going to be watered down. And you're actually going to help the system, right? Because liberalism views critique as a foundation. Oh, look, we take critique. You can see, here's a watered down version of right-wingism you can employ and use. So they basically pimp out these quote-unquote right-wing beliefs or quote-unquote anti-status beliefs, but in reality, they don't harm the system. They give the illusion of the system being, open and free, while in reality it's just kind of a prerequisite of what Yarvin or Moldbug would call, the cathedral mind control. It's the illusion. It's giving your 2-year-old brother a toy remote, because he keeps on grabbing the damn remote every time you try to watch TV. So give him a toy remote, so he thinks he's actually turning the channel. In reality, he isn't. But he keeps you from annoying him. Basically, that's the critique of dialectics, of liberal dialectics. Basically, foundational.
Yeah, right.
If that's want to hear more about that, actually, our Schmidt episode, which actually, when this releases, our Schmidt episode will be out. We go into more because there was a lot of Schmidt in what you just said.
Yeah. You did that with that Swede, the damn Swede.
Yeah, Dr. Yun Wittrock.
Yeah. Initially we were supposed to do it. Well, first I wanted to do a Spengler episode, but at first, as we soon did DMs, Jack was like, "No, Gabe, we were not doing a Spengler episode."
I mean, I'd still like to do at least an episode, but probably a few episodes on the second part of The Decline of the West, which is that it's a slightly more, I don't know if I'd call it practical, but it's more connected to everyday reality than him talking about studio brown and blue-green as color expressions of the Faustian soul.
Germany's second most confident author is Oswald Spengler.
Yeah, Spengler was very confident. Not quite as confident as Hoppe, but Hoppe is almost elementally confident.
True. And that what makes him so interesting. And if you notice, we do the same thing with another favorite author of ours, Seyfeddin Ammous. Another favorite of us is that, if you see any Austrian type libertarian in a podcast, they're very, very much, some would say combative, but they very much have a very strong personality.
I think everyone would say combative.
Yes.
Yeah. They're always very
the ideology of libertarianism, particularly the Austrian school, it takes something as the built into the concept of a priori thinking and the rejection of empiricism is kind of, you have to kind of have an instinctual, not say a level of anti-socialism to kind of to believe that full-heartedly and to argue.
Just call it autism. You don't need to be nice.
You have to have severe autism. That's why just so many libertarians now. The autism rates are skyrocketing. Right, the vaccines were backfired on the deep state. Actually, we weaponized the vaccines against them.
What's the correlation between vaccination rates and libertarian incidents? Yeah.
So I guess we don't have to go through the book chapter by chapter, but so listeners are aware, the book is more like a collection of essays, so you don't have to read it in order. However, if anybody is going to go and read it, the first chapter you should definitely read first.
Yeah, because that's the time preference chapter.
Yeah, and so maybe it'll be good to have a quick discussion on, again, we've sort of like mentioned this in other podcasts, so we don't need to necessarily go into as much detail, but there's a couple of, I'd say there's like 3 extremely important concepts from the Austrian school concepts that they take really seriously and think have very far-reaching effects and far-reaching explanatory power that like mainstream economists don't have. And those 3 things are, one, like subjectivism, or like subjective value versus like objective value. 2, marginality or marginal decision making, and 3, time preference, which is is like one of the key parts of this particular book.
That's like this book
lays the foundation of like everything else. So the first thing, like subjectivism, is basically like the Austrians say, and I would agree with them, that like any particular product or service or object or whatever doesn't have like value isn't an attribute of that object. Value is a process going on in the mind of the individual interacting with that object. And so when somebody values something, there's not like a util, there's not an objective quantity associated with value of that object, like Marx would assert. But what they're doing is with their knowledge and goals, they're saying, like, if they're engaging in an exchange, they're saying, okay, the money that I'm giving up to get this thing, I value less than the thing that I'm getting in return for it. And all that you can say is, like, for any particular exchange pair, that the person giving up the thing values the thing that they're getting in return more than what they're giving up. And it's subjective, and no two actors can say that one that the other person's subjective valuation of something is somehow, like, invalid or whatever. That doesn't mean that they're subjectivists, like, across everything, across, like, knowledge is subjective, or you can't make objective claims about praxeology or whatever, which they obviously do think that you can make objective claims about the world in praxeology and so forth. But what they mean is, like, the valuation process of an economic actor is subjective. There's no objective measure of value. The second thing is marginality, which is just to say that when people are engaging in action and economic decision making, they have to make concrete decisions at specific times under resource constraints that are idiosyncratic to their specific circumstances at that time. They're not making decisions about, like, say, if they need to buy lumber, they're not considering, like, all the entire stockpile of the lumber in the entire society or at all times or anything abstract like that. They're thinking, okay, I have this much money, I want to build a house, how much lumber do I need? Am I going to buy, like, a little bit of slack? Do I want a little bit extra lumber to, like, reduce my risk of, like, any issues? Or am I just going to buy exactly the amount that I've calculated that I need for the house? And those decisions at the margin, meaning, like, for a given amount of good that they could be giving up or getting, they're thinking about the next unit of that they're going to purchase or get rid of in an exchange. They're thinking about, like, the next unit engaged in resource use. So they say, like, quote unquote, at the margin. And then the last most important like concept I've come across in all of Austrian economics is time preference. And time preference is, Jack actually had a really good way of explaining it before, but my way of thinking about it is basically, like, the degree to which you prefer, like, present consumption over, like, future consumption. And the lower your time preference is, the more you can think about the future and engage in action that benefits you in further and further in the future, such as, like, building a business or building a production process or saving. And the higher your time preference, the higher you prefer the present, the more likely you are to, like, consume all of your money, not save, not engage in long, complex production processes, and so forth. And time preference plays a crucial role in this book. It's like the most important concept in this book.
Yeah, it forms the background of basically everything he says.
Yeah, it's like the most. It's like his entire argument, like, comes out of time preference.
Yeah, which is why, to what you were saying earlier about how this book is structured. One, as an aside, I really like how it's structured from the perspective of learning, because each chapter will repeat a lot of the same things, and so you're just having this constant spaced repetition, and so you can read it once, probably even without taking notes, and you'll be able to retain it quite well just because of how it's written, and I like that a lot. But read the introduction and the first chapter first, and then read whatever takes your fancy, whether it's, maximizing intolerance, whether it's privatized defense, whatever. Take your pick. Because also, I think it's important to note, in the introduction, he lays out his methodology and how he thinks about things. And I do like that he's so upfront with this, because what he says is, in this book, what I'm doing is I'm taking a priori theories, so theories that just assume that certain things are the case a priori, and then applying those or using those to interpret data. because he says like you can't interpret data without some sort of underlying theory, otherwise it's just noise. And I like that he lays that out at the beginning, so you know very, very clearly where he's coming from and how he's understanding things in the world. And I think it's really, really valuable for basically anyone thinking or anyone writing this sort of book to say how they're actually interpreting the world. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, it's a great tool for clear-pilled thinking a lot of ways, because he argues so well. The way he portrays his ideas, where he communicates his ideas. I mean, is he vulgar in certain areas? Does he use some harsh language from time to time? I mean, yes. But overall, I would definitely say he is very logically consistent, and he is beautiful the way he argues. Because the confidence lends him this mastery of able to communicate his ideas. And on the time preference point, because, the folk, especially from an American standpoint, libertarians are viewed very much as a leftist thing, because the idea of personal body freedom. And so this battle of identity within the libertarian movement, when you read Democracy That God It Failed, the most stickiest part for, let's say, the e-right or internet culture is time preference. Because if you're into manosphere, well, that's R versus K selection. You know what I mean? That's it. You could easily, like Anon, you give this book to Anon from Incel, he would get this immediately.
Shout out to Eric Hahn.
Yeah. You can easily see Anon loving this book, despite him not giving a damn about economics. Because it fits into evolutionary, eugenic, dysgenic theory of biological determinism very, very well. Because he says to such a degree that a welfare state desensitizes future orientation of thinking to such a degree. He brings up the birth rate thing, which was a novel thing in the early 2010s. People talk about birth rate all the times now, but it was mostly NRX blogs and very discreet blogs back in 2014 era that talked about the birth rate thing. And that the time preference thing that's why I say the time preference thing is the key to libertarianism. That's why its relation to the far right, or the e-right, as we call the internet right, and what makes Nick Land so interested in Hoppe. I mean, he mentions Hoppe, I believe, in A Dark Enlightenment. It shows libertarianism in a new light. Instead of the present-oriented theory of liberty and freedom, it's about the future orientation of civilization. The real key to time preference is not that you can have 10 fish later and then have 5 fish now, the classic Robinson Crusoe example that Hoppe loves to use. The real key of time preference is that it is the key to civilization itself. That what you are now is nothing. Everything you do should be oriented towards the future. It's actually it's in a lot of ways built in time preference is a moral judgment, especially in way Hoppe uses time preference. You are specifically going against the laws of nature, natural law. If you are orienting your actions for present pleasures or present anything, you are going against natural laws itself. And that's is also an aspect of, let's say, religious curiosity within time preference. It is some way didactic. There's a moral implicit to time preference. Time preference is very much intrinsically moralistic. That's why Hoppe notoriously thinks, he got hot water in America for saying that homosexuals have a built-in high time preference because they don't.
It's just like such classic Hoppe.
That's
take one
Hoppe.
of his principles and just storm out into social issues.
Yeah.
Yes.
He definitely wasn't trying to make any friends or reach across the aisle on this one.
It's the same thing with he'll use the same justification. In a speech he said notoriously, objectively speaking, because he's so confident in his a priori beliefs. He says, "I'd rather be privately owned as a slave in the South or wherever slavery is practiced than be a quote unquote citizen of the Soviet Union." And the thing is, he is so well versed in his thought, and he's so articulate in his thought. You will have a hard time seeing an Austrian type who's so dedicated to the Hoppian ideal of successionism and exit over voice, the idea of spatializing difference rather than articulating or participating in forced politics. Like seeing someone debate the Civil War, like Hoppe. Most of the people who are pro-union would actually have a hard time debating Hoppe. Because for Hoppe, it's not necessarily a moral issue. The moral issue is the fact that fracture itself is a virtue, right? Because the mechanism of being in a fracture of a smaller state, fracturing itself on a bigger state, is in itself a moral good. because in order to survive as a smaller state will lead you to liberal principles. Free market, if you know, smaller states or states that succeed from larger states tend to have open liberal policies. I think he says this as an example. Like, you cannot survive. You have to have a certain sense of attracting the best people, having no regulations, right? Because people need to want to live with you, right? You want to attract people. It has the threat of exit, be it an exit from your country or using it as even a violent threat. I want to attract the smart, the best, and the boldest from your country, and basically a weaponized brain training, right? I want to take the best from your country. He uses an example of the Eastern Bloc, is that, we used their immigration against the Soviet Union because for more freedom. The wall was to keep them in, not us out.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You can see that starting to play out, and the sovereign individual actually talks about this almost game theoretic dynamic of different jurisdictions trying to attract, like the most productive people in this, increasingly digital workers or entrepreneurs and stuff, based on they're extremely productive. They probably pay taxes, not use social services and so forth, but they're also extremely highly mobile. So they have the ability to move between jurisdictions, and therefore, it puts pressure on states to try to actually appeal to them on the grounds of the quality of the services that they can provide and so forth. Like, how good is the visa in, you see this in Indonesia versus Thailand versus Portugal versus Spain. They all are coming out with these digital nomad visas and new PR schemes to try to attract these digital workers and stuff.
It's same thing with Baja and the network state. You know what I mean? It's exit, revealed preference is a much safer way of public dissent than voice-oriented dialectics. Because with voice, it welcomes in conflict in a lot of ways. It has potentiality becoming political in the Schmittian sense. The Schmittian being political being violence. Politics is violence. It's simply, war is not the extension of politics. Clausewitz got it wrong. War is politics. That's something. I'm always. The idea of convergent evolution, two species of crab in totally different environments evolved to come to the same thing. You see this in a lot of ways in Lenin's analysis of Clausewitz and Schmidt's analysis of Clausewitz. Is that politics is inherently. That's why, if you notice, out of all the socialist states in Europe, Rosa, I forget her name, Rosa, the German woman, she failed. A lot of them failed. Lenin was the only one that succeeded. Vanguard socialism was considered elitist. Most mainstream Marxists hated Bolsheviks because you're all just intellectuals. It's clear as day. You're just using a pincer movement of intellectuals and proletariat. You're using them as a meat shield, basically. It's clear as day. Even Bakunin's critique of vanguardism. But Rosa Luxemburg, she's dead in a river, and Lenin has a Warhammer 40K god body on display right now. In reality, it was pure realpolitik that vanguardism allowed his version of socialism to thrive. And you see there's version of vanguardism here in Hoppe. In a lot of ways, is that he says in the text, any secession movement. That's why in America in particular, libertarianism is so associated with the South and the Civil War and the big question of slavery, right? Is that in Hoppe's view, any amount of choosing exit is libertarian ethics is being away from the state, away from politics. We want to in a libertarian society, politics does not exist. Because politics, it's the same thing if you have a department of something, it makes the situation worse, that classic libertarian thing. America passes a Department of Education and half the kids no longer can read anymore. It's the classic thing of making a department of X. If the AI cells wanted to succeed, they'll make a department of AI and we will solve the AI overlord problem tomorrow, basically, from their point of view. The ethics of libertarianism is I'd much rather separate from you. And the libertarian nightmare, the classic with Peter Thiel, his horror, he wanted to do seasteading. Seasteading was partly his idea with Patrick Friedman, boat states, floating boat independent anarcho states. Is that I no longer believe democracy and freedom are compatible. It was a big revelation at the time. It was it was a shocking thing. He mentioned it in Dark Enlightenment. And it's the case. The horror of a libertarian is to get very internet on you, the back rooms. The back room is a place with it's a place with no exit, and the internal other is always there with you, always watching you. The internal other being the state, the other entity, and it's a place with no exit. And an old line from the NRX days is that a neo-reactionary is just a libertarian that got mugged by reality. You know what I mean? It's the idealism of libertarianism is that realizing I have no exit. All I have is this dude, this creepy being, this creepy entity, the state, other people, anything, this weird otherness constantly seeing me, constantly watching me. I can't avoid him. There is no exit. So you have to grab an axe, and you either have to hit the wall or hit the entity, right? And that's how, the Schmittian element, it gets melded into Hoppe, and then that's how you get a Moldbug, basically. Is that, in order to have proper exit, you had to choose economics or exit. Basically, the economy has to be subservient to the state. And that's why, for example, Curtis lands on the Buchanan side of the argument with protectionism, is that busy work is fundamentally good for people to a certain degree. Busy work at least gives them something to do, especially when you follow the train of logic of, let's say, UBI and AI taking most jobs. I mean, if you take the intrinsic logic, half of, manual labor jobs from 20 years ago, half of them are gone. In 20 years from now, is there going to be more manual labor jobs or less manual labor jobs? And the criteria, the high IQ, like you realize, there's a certain hard limit of human value. Like, Yarvin is smart, but compared to the most intelligent programmer today, he's no one. And the standards of people to make these technology keeps on getting higher and higher and higher. When you have a Tesla bot, like I forget, not Optimus Prime, I think it's Prime something, doing most of the manual labor, and most of the digitalized jobs can be done by some form of advanced chat GPT model, fundamentally, the only work available to humans that aren't programmers or people just maintaining technology would be quote unquote busy work. Yeah, it's simply to avoid, ennui or mass psychosis. So Yarvin takes a culturally eugenic argument against Hoppe. And I wanted to ask you this, because Hoppe says, even if immigration benefits you economically, well, values are subjective. You can subjectively value being away from foreigners more. But he doesn't give that same credence to tariffs. For some reason, he doesn't give Buchanan that same benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that he gave it, literally a previous chapter, I believe, he literally gave the benefit of the doubt to, even if immigration is good economically, we can subjectively value low immigration more than economic value. But for some reason, he doesn't do the same framework with tariffs.
I reckon. So there are a few things to that I want to say, maybe to clear some stuff up for listeners. And then I'll lay out a few of Hoppe's first principles, and we can go through those, because those will make it more clear to listeners where he's coming from and how he gets to some of his positions. We can talk about his concrete positions too. For people who haven't read The Dark Enlightenment or aren't as deep in neo-reaction or its more modern offshoots, this idea of voice versus exit is really important. So it's basically in a political situation, or I guess you can probably generalize it to any situation. You've got two options, voice and exit. Voice you can basically think of as participation in whatever situation you're currently in. So if you're in a democracy, voice could be participating in free speech, it could be participating in elections, it could be political, say, small p political participation, so say signing up to your local Labor Party branch or something like that, or talking to people and so on. Exit is, instead of participating, it's just leaving. So it can be something formalized like secession from a state, so you form your own territorial area. It can be moving to another state. It's basically picking up your toys and leaving and not participating. Then, having said that, I think laying out actually a constitution that Hoppe proposes lays out his first principles nicely, because he's got a few things that he says, these are just true. Things like private property based on, he calls it, I think it's original appropriation, that's it, where basically someone finds some natural resource, some like a stick lying on the ground and picks it up. Now this guy's mixed his label with it, and the stick belongs to that person. And from this original appropriation, this owner of the stick can do whatever they want with the stick, including give it to someone else. And once they've given it to someone else, it's that person's property, and it always traces all its way back to this original appropriation. So his constitution, which lays out his first principles nicely, 1, everyone owns their body. You've got self-ownership. You can do what you want with your body. 2, everyone can do what they want with their property so long as this doesn't uninvitedly change the physical integrity of another's property. 3, all exchanges between property owners are contractual, that is to say voluntary, so that it's not coerced by someone else. 4, all violations can be prosecuted by the victim or his agent. So that's a nice framework to get a handle on Hoppe's first principles. And what this entire book is basically taking these and just pushing them as far as they go. He just follows these to their logical conclusion. Now, this is an advantage and a disadvantage of Hoppe, because if you disagree with one of his first principles, then you're fucked. You're just not going to agree with him. And he does not hold out really any olive branches for people who are not there with him on the ground level. It's an advantage in that you've got a very clear idea of what he believes and where he's coming from. And I think clarity is one of this book's biggest strengths. From these first principles, where do you want to jump off to? We've talked about time preference. We've talked about the process of civilization and decivilization. So he basically thinks the lower your time preference is, the less you value having something right now versus in the future, the more civilized you become. And if you push this idea of time preference and civilization, say lowering time preferences also lowers violence. Because if you imagine you've got crazy high time preference and you see someone with, I don't know, something you want, well, the highest time preference thing you can do is run over to that person and club them over the head and steal whatever they've got. And as time preference decreases, you might do something like, instead of just stealing their stuff, you might trade for it, or you might work for it, which is trading your labor for it. All sorts of things. And he basically views civilization as this emergent process of lowering time preference. So it's almost this latent possibility in humans if you can lower their time preferences.
Yeah. Maybe it'd be good to like unpack it a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like largely, because it's just so important, like largely speaking. So von Mises had this idea of category of action, or praxeological category. And it's kind of hard to explain, so it's better just to use an example. Mm-hmm. So, time preference is a praxeological category, and what he's saying is, what are the specific causes of somebody's high time preference or low time preference? Doesn't really matter. That's irrelevant. It could be a psychological factor. It could be, I don't know, like psychiatric. Maybe somebody's got, I don't know, like psychosis and they're very high like time preference, or maybe they have a drug addiction, so they're very high time preference. Maybe it could be cultural. Maybe they've grown up in a community that owns businesses and saves a lot and all that sort of stuff, and so it has a very low time preference. It could be physiological. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, like there's a whole bunch of someone's age, like teenagers.
Like a baby's time preference is basically infinite.
But basically, because it's a category, it doesn't really matter what the specific concrete causes in any particular individual's circumstance is. The fact that their time preference is higher or lower, or becoming higher or lower, is what's important. And at a social level, the more that the individuals within a society have lower and lower time preference, the more they're able to do things like save money for the future, act in ways where, even something like working out regularly and eating healthy is a low time preference thing to do. It'll help you when you're older, have better health. Having children tends to be a lower time preference thing to do, because in the future, you'll have a family, a community, maybe people to look after you when you're in old age and so forth. And obviously things like engaging in a long, complex, uncertain production process in order to create something that is much higher productivity than any of your production processes now, that requires a low time preference to defer current consumption during the creation of that production process, so that in the future you have the new production process and you have high yield and higher productivity. But during the creation of that production process, you need to defer consumption or use up your savings. So the argument being, if everybody in society, it's obviously not going to be distributed evenly between everybody, but sort of on the whole, if a society or a civilization is lowering their time preference, they're going to build up, one, the capital stock, so like intermediate goods for production, for creating other goods. They're going to be able to invest in like long-term projects. They're going to invest in families and communities and institutions that are maybe even intergenerational. And so the lowering of the time preference is incredibly important. And one of the key pieces of evidence that he asserts is from the Austrian theory of interest rates, which is completely fucked up by the fiat system. But under a hard money standard, like the idea would be that the interest rate that you're willing to accept reflects your time preference. So if you demand a high interest rate, that means you've got a high time preference because you want to be rewarded at a higher rate for sacrificing your current consumption now to lend it out to somebody. Whereas if you're willing to sacrifice having access to your savings now at a lower time preference, it means that you're willing to tolerate a lower return for deferring present consumption from the person that you're lending the money to. So interest rate, the time preference theory of interest rates is saying that like that's any individual's preference is the interest rate that they're willing to accept is an indicator of their time preference. But on a social level, like across an entire country or a society, that's going to be indicative of the society as a whole. Like the interest rates are going to be indicative of the society's time preference. And he basically notes that over time, especially under like hard money standards, we see this gradual decrease of the interest rates in different societies, except when there's situations where there's like currency debasement, or there's like price controls or these economic, issues. And in the case of the West and like modern civilization, we see this like massive increase in interest rates recently against the backdrop of like, especially in the 18th and 19th century, like very, very low interest rates, increasingly low interest rates. And so he's saying like, okay, we're seeing this increase in time preference, not only in terms of like, you can see like, what happens to communities when they're on welfare and like the issues that those communities can have around like unemployment and stuff like that. But also in terms of like, actually like it's directly indicated by the interest rates in the society. And so time preference, I hope that's enough on time preference. It's
it's good to hammer it because it's so foundational to this book.
Yeah, you can't have a society build up infrastructure, institutions, capital stock, and so forth without some meaningful number of the people having a low enough time preference to build those things. And so civilization depends on the accrual of all of those things based on time preference and hopefully lowering time preference.
I think also a key to understanding where Hoppe is coming from is understanding his idea of time preference, understanding his idea of private property from original appropriation, and then sticking these to his idea of natural order. So, and what he means when he uses the term conservatism, because he uses conservatism in I consider it a slightly atypical way. So when I hear the word conservatism, I think of, say, Edmund Burke, where I guess how Burke wrote, in that I'm not sure he even really considered himself to be a philosopher because he was always addressing very, very concrete, specific issues, is characteristic of this. When when I hear conservatism, what I basically think of is someone who has sufficient respect or reverence for traditions that have persisted over time. Their posture towards things that have existed for a long time is that they're probably doing something important if those things have been around for a long time. So say when Burke was writing, say, famously with respect to the French monarchy, he basically thought, okay, well, the monarchy's been around for a really long time. It more or less works. So it's probably doing something important. And even if you don't know what it's doing, even if you can't explain what it's doing, that doesn't mean it's not important. So for most, and I think for a lot of people in the Western world and the United States, certainly in Australia, that's what most think of when they think of conservatism. It's that posture towards the past. And within that paradigm, say a Saudi conservative and an Australian conservative are actually going to believe quite different things, although both of them will have a similar posture to the past. What Hoppe means when he talks about conservatism is, I guess this is just semantics on my part, I think of as perennialism. It feels more like what someone like Julius Evola would say, where Hoppe says there are these eternal underlying realities that are always there, and it's our job to uncover them. And he sees these things as being, for example, the family unit being the foundational unit of society. He says this is just fundamental. This is something that's always the case, whether you like it or not. And thinking about the world is really uncovering these things rather than devising anything new. And similarly, another thing that is always the case for Hoppe and is an essential part of conservatism is this idea of a natural elite. He says that within any group of people, there are going to be some who are more competent than others, who are going to be more driven than others, who are going to start basically organizing other people around them and impressing their will upon the social group within which they exist. And basically the job of any sort of societal governance is to let these people rule. So to let the natural order express itself. And he sees things like, for example, the welfare state, which involves taking money from people who have a lot and giving it to those who have little, as a distortion of that and something that corrupts the natural order and doesn't let it fully express itself.
Yeah, elite rule is a spontaneous act with Hoppe. It's completely spontaneous. And that's another big conflict with him and the Buchanan kind of conservatives, is that, with the Buchanan conservatives, it has to be inculcated, it has to be maintained, it's something you constantly have to fiddle with it. Well, with Hoppe, it's completely spontaneous. If you literally just stop fucking with it, it will just spontaneously emerge. These elites, these natural leaders, these natural community leaders, they're beautiful, the talent, that will just simply do. You can just simply do things in Hoppe's world, and you don't have to have the all-seeing eye of the state hovering over you. And another aspect you brought up, what's funny about Democracy, the God That Failed, is that he slow rolls the libertarian and the Austrian economics. The first major part of the Democracy, the God That Failed is World War I revisionism, and how great Austria was. He has a lot of Austrian nostalgia. In this, and when you read this book, by the end of it, you reread the first chapter, and you realize, you see this kind of what he's kind of saying to a certain degree, is that Americans destroy everything. Destroy the Americans as a. And it's funny you mentioned Edmund Burke, and this is the frame game. You never ask Edmund Burke who he supported in the 1770s. You know what I mean? And like in the American Revolutionary War, who was left wing, who was right wing, in y'all's opinion?
Well, Burke was, he wasn't a Tory. He was a Whig.
Right, exactly. What's interesting when you read someone like Moldbug, for example, this is the interesting with libertarians, is that another major big problem, Hoppe's problem, is that you need a foundation, a historical foundation for your belief structure as well. You need to engage in history. Which is something he says, he says what Rothbard taught, because Rothbard was also a historian as well. He wrote about the Great Depression, history of the American colonies, and so forth. So you got to treat history like a murder scene. It's something you have to construct, you have to engineer, you have to engage with it with your hands, basically. It's an engineering problem. And, the thing is, he would say, most historians don't know anything about economics. They don't know anything at all. You will read someone say, the invention of fractional reserve banking is what caused, civilization. From a very, very clueless historian. He will, of course, being Hoppe, would say he's a dumb clueless historian. The causal effects.
Did somebody actually say that?
Yes, it was Carol. It was Carol Quigley, I believe. Carol Quigley in the history of I think England or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But the thing is, historians don't have a day of what Hoppe's critique and what everyone's critique within the Austrian School is that with democracy that got to fail. They see we have iPhone now. We're off the gold standard. And so the relation to these two things is the causal relationship that people make in their brains is like, oh, we don't need gold. Back when we had gold, we didn't have the iPhone. We didn't have penicillin. So therefore, obviously, we're richer now after the Great Depression than before, and we're off the gold standard. So they make that inference. And what Hoppe says is, no. Well, you don't understand. You're getting the causal relationship wrong. We would be infinitely wealthier and infinitely better off. We're wealthy despite this. Whatever we have right now as a baseline, we have despite that, not because of it. And he says the same thing with democracy. We have a certain living standards despite democracy, not because of it. And it's the same thing with if you notice with the American Civil War, Revolutionary War. As a Tory myself, I call this the English Civil War. Is that what people don't know actually? One of the biggest criticisms of the empire of the monarchy was how in the Russian Revolution, like the first 2 years, they actually tried to give up money. And they had to reinvent money for first principles.
War communism, where they just said, no money now. We're done.
The American equivalent with the Patriots, the founding fathers, one of the early biggest hot topic issues was that the mayor of Boston did not like paper money. The founding fathers, a lot of the early American revolutionaries were fond of paper money. Yeah. No, this was actually a controversial issue at the time. It was a leading causing issue. Is a lot of the first 10 years of America was sadly very much a leftist creation. Pro-fiat currency, and very, very pro, what would say, anarchy in the Articles of Confederation era. And it leads to an awkward revolution. Because when you have institutional libertarianism is kind of intrinsically intertwined with America in a lot of fundamental ways. It's founded by non-Americans. It has that aristocratic bloodline, but it's a uniquely an American contradiction. And it's everything in America. Nick Land has this term. There's a internal battle between America and the United States. The United States and America, a country that's founded on exit, but is preserved and kind of fighting itself as united, chained. It's a deep conflict in the American psyche between freedom, exit, and institutionalism, and being the most successful global empire the world has ever seen. And you see this in a lot of ways with Levi mentioned this in terms of global warfare about fiat currency. You can't have a global war without fiat currency. That's another interesting thing Hoppe brings up, is that if you read Henry V or anything like this, Henry V would had to check how much money do I have in my vaults and so forth. And not only that, much like, oddly enough, the three estate structure acted kind of like this. The king was a sort of CEO, but his noblemen, his aristocracy, were a lot like a board, and he couldn't do whatever he wanted. That's why all noblemen had castles. Half the time was so the king really wanted you to do something. His baron could tell him to fuck off, and he would have to siege the damn castle. There would be a conflict. There had to be a fight, and he had to argue his case. The three estates were very much a weirdly emergent, very balanced order of king, aristocracy, and the peasants. And a lot of times, the king would do what the socialists do, is that he would choose an oppressed class, the peasants, and say, oh, this baron, he didn't want to fund my war, that son of a bitch. Oh, is he oppressing peasants? He would then use a populist revolution. He would support a populist revolution against that particular baron, and then basically bully him into supporting him and giving him his money. It's still not for his, you could say he doesn't care about the peasants. Yeah, exactly.
The primordial high-low coalition.
Motivated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. As all politics, there's always a sense of realpolitik. So, and a lot of times the king would go against the quote-unquote middle class and do the high-low coalition. That's exactly right. And Safadine mentions this, is that one benefit, quote-unquote benefit of fiat currency is that purchases are quicker. Traveling gold across lands, it takes obviously it takes longer to transfer gold than it does fiat currency. But in a lot of ways, I'd say that is a benefit. The fact that you can't instantly make a decision, the fact that you have to have a relationship.
Put some friction in your, wanting to just like buy random stuff off Amazon or something. If you actually had to send Papa Jeff some gold.
Exactly. It's exactly right. There's actually, even the fact that it takes a while for purchases, quote unquote global purchases, the fact it takes time, it gives you hesitation to have that instant, like rat clicking up the heroin button kind of thing. And and you see that with an interesting thing with in the early chapters when he talks about war, the fact that the sovereign layer, that the state acts above the fact that there is a sense of class. In America, there's no sense of class. In a democracy, they try to mask the sense of class, like I mentioned with the little kid at a toy remote. In a monarchy, the king has to fight. Listen, I have to pay my men. I have my own private reserve. I know what I need to spend. And if I'm also, and not only that, during that time, he literally is putting his own life on the line for all our Swedish. I mean, y'all are what, the 50th most popular podcast in Sweden, right?
Maybe,
yeah. To quote Adolphus Rex, I mean, the glory age of Sweden was when the king literally fought on the front lines. He died taking a bullet to the head, and he was a tactical genius, right? He made that risk assessment again and again and again based on his own innate talents, his own relationship with time preference. Everything comes back to time preference. Your relation with time preference is actually a physical, tangible relationship. I'm going to take this risk for a potential future benefit. But in order to even take that risk, you have to have an understanding of what are you capable of now? What is my nobleman capable of now? With fiat, again, you can snap your fingers and retroactively justify yourself later. With something when it's a hard currency, with both hard currency of, let's say, of money, also the hard currency of your own physical labor, of not just technical warfare, of actual physical warfare. You have the hard currency of what am I capable of? What are my noblemen capable of? What are the people fighting underneath me capable of? If I push them too hard, I can have a revolt. And a lot of times kings would take this thing. How much can I push the populace without having a revolt at my hands?
There's a calculus going on.
Right. And something like the COVID lockdown, so forth, could never happen in a monarchical state because the justifications for it are just simply absurd. Well, A, they don't have the power to do so. Financially, they have no power to do so. But because within fiat is the implicit submission to the state, is fiat, it's waving your hands. It's the trust within the state. So any criticism of fiat, Keynes has been proven wrong time and time and again, but Keynesians will just retroactively justify themselves. So the innate incentive structure of fiat currency is fiat everything. Fiat risk. There's no human risk anymore. There's no anything anymore. There's fiat life. In a lot of ways, we live through pure technical masturbation. Everything is through. We basically our lives are already virtual reality in a lot of senses. When you live, and that's one of the greatest books I would say is actually Amus's book on the fiat standard. Even in terms of building a house, and in terms of a monarchy, for example, the building of cathedrals or churches, those things would take on an average almost 100 to 300 years. I think a German church took like 800 years. It was only completed relatively recently in the last 20 years or so. In the world of fiat, I think this is an example he gives in fiat standard. You have houses that barely, or complexes that barely last 20 years. It all ties back down to these men know they're building something, and they're building a house they'll never sleep in. They're building a house they'll never see the interior of its roof.
There's this nice saying. I think it's like, wise men plant seeds that they'll never sit under the shadow of, or something to that effect.
It's a great quote.
That. something, like the oaks that Oxford University used to construct like new buildings or whatever, if I remember correctly, were planted like 400 years ago, and they're only just like starting to, utilize them now. That sort of stuff.
And the thing is, to commit to something, like even for us, I'd say we're all very low time preference individuals. But even to justify, you're going to build something which will take your grandchildren will not see, and you're going to work and sweat to do it. I'd say even for people like us, that's actually a hard bill to swallow. The fact you're going to commit so much of your own physical effort. And the thing is, you can't communicate the benefits of that with people who have high time preference. And again, this is a built-in feature. There's literally, you can't communicate between high time preference and low time preference. There's no real dialogue between the two because it's an a priori thing, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have they don't have the theory of mind. It's the problem, AI problem of theory of mind. A high time preference individual, a high time preference view of life, literally cannot conceive of a certain amount of future actions, and that's the other issue.
It might even be
voice.
like relate back to subjective valuation. Like I can't make somebody value my pot plants, my lovely, beautiful house plants that I have in my home office, as much as I value them. And I can't make somebody value their own future as much as I might value my own future, or, past my own life, whatever. So there's probably a degree of like that lowering of one's time preference. I'm sure there's probably a cultural component of it, and there's like an economic component of it, but also a lot of it would come down to an individual like figuring this stuff out and then changing their subjective valuations of the future versus the present and so forth.
And that's
So
pop off. No, go off. No, go.
So I was just going to say, one way we can frame this in the context of the episode is the differences or the comparisons between monarchy and democracy that Hoppe puts forward, because I think that nicely encompasses a lot of the things we're talking about at the moment.
So could I suggest like we talk about that and talk about his specific meaning, and then we kind of circle back to time preference under monarchy and democracy, and especially the effects of lowering or so what things can lower time preference or increase time preference, and what are those effects on a society? Yeah, that might be really interesting.
That's really the skeleton.
Like the rest of the book. Yeah.
The skeleton of this book is basically, you've got your natural order, you've got a state, and there are various types of states, and what do those things do to time preference, and what are the emergent effects of those various distortions of the natural order?
So we've got like 4 key concepts then to like briefly like say what
Let's define the state.
Well, what Hoppe means, but also like for the most part what, as far as I understand, like other Austrian economists mean when they say, in particular, the 4 terms that I'd be looking at is the state, democracy, monarchy, socialism. And those are probably the 4 main ones that have a very specific meaning for him.
He's very clear about what he means by the state. So the state is basically a compulsory territorial monopoly on taxation and
aggression.
law.
Yeah, so jurisdiction, the ability to make laws, the ability to change property rights, take property away, tax, the exclusive monopoly within a territory to be able to do that.
Yeah, and this ultimately rests on violence, which for Hoppe is illegitimate. Because if you think back to that constitution he laid out, he said all exchanges between property owners are contractual. And a contract for Hoppe is voluntary. So it's 2 or more parties entering into a voluntary exchange. And so for the state, because it's a compulsory monopoly, that's not contractual. He has absolutely no time for social contract theory.
Yeah.
he says this is all predicated on violence. So the state or agents of the state are physically more powerful than you, which is the case. It's like in Australia, I can't haggle with the government. The government can send people to my house who are armed to kick my head in if I don't play by their rules. They are a territorial monopoly. So it's really important to know precisely what Hoppe means when he talks about the state. And so that's what the state is.
Yeah,
and this is something that sits on top of natural order, because for him, again, natural order it's very biologically instantiated. You've got this natural elite, and if you just let this natural elite be, because they're naturally low time preference, they will start the process of civilization. They will start accumulating goods. They will start producing capital goods. They will start forming order around themselves spontaneously.
So I was wondering, Gabe, I actually struggled with I think I've actually mentioned this in previous episodes, like the one thing that I struggle with libertarianism and the Austrians is when they rely on this idea of natural order, natural law, natural whatever, and I find it's like a weakness in the overall like structure of their thinking, because oftentimes I feel like when they start talking about natural law, it's very hand wavy. It happens to be whatever the particular author thinks should be like the way that the world is. So that, since we've got you on the show and you might know a little bit more about this than me, like could you like shed some light on what like a natural order is, what and natural law, and like relieve me of my ignorance.
Well, to be honest with you, I'll straight up concede that it is actually 100% irrational. I'll quote, friend of the show, David Foster Wallace, RAP, is that there's no such thing as atheism. It is a 100%, it is a religious instinct, I'd say, within libertarians, this idea of natural law. I mean, of course, Hoppe, being intrinsically autistic and very, very much a thorough mechanical thinker, will justify it, but you can tell it's an instinctual gut feeling. Is the idea of the epistemology of belief is built in the idea of a priori thinking to a certain degree. There's an intrinsic leap of faith and a very conviction to faith in Schmitt, yet again, the idea of like, whatever you believe in is what you're willing to die for, fundamentally, on the Schmittian understanding of it. If you're willing to literally physically kill another human being and be killed, that's what you believe in, right? And so I'd say fundamentally it fills the idea of natural law fills the God-shaped hole within libertarian thought, and yes,
yeah. Because
or
you could pretty easily say violence is pretty natural. I mean, we've observed it for a long time in humans, and someone forcibly taking someone else's stuff is. I mean, I'm not sure why you would say that's any less natural than voluntary exchange.
Well, yeah, when you use reason, like it basically you're subjecting the eye of God. God is watching you, that kind of thing. It's like, oh, that's against natural law. It's against your, you should rationally realize that you could work your way up to get that piece of property and all these things.
Yeah.
But you're working away from your automatic assumption is violence is bad. Well, why is it bad? Well, I'll retroactively make a reason why, which is the libertarian version of what Karl Popper described with Freudianism. That's actually a built-in thing. One of my great book to pair with this actually is Jonathan Haidt's what's it called? The Righteous Mind. It's an excellent book. I think y'all will love it. He basically does multiple studies to confirm that Vilfredo Pareto's theory is that a lot of people have instinctual beliefs first, and then they like retroactively walk backwards their beliefs. And the reason it fundamentally is, he says the elephant and the rider. All the rider can do on an elephant is to try to stay on and try to look cool for the ladies. It's like, oh yeah, I'm totally guiding this lion. Guiding this elephant. I'm totally in control of this elephant. But in reality, you're just kind of retroactively justifying. You're pretending retroactively to actually be controlling the elephant. And it's the same thing with belief systems.
So I guess I feel like, as much as I do like a lot of their thinking, like with this particular point, it's a sticking point for me. In particular, like sometimes they say, I think Rothbard says this, and I believe Hoppe says this in this book. He says it's self-evident, and just as a, like, just from Popper and Deutsch's explanation of epistemology, there's nothing that's self-evident. Like, all knowledge is conjectural, and something. So one of the implications of saying that natural law or natural rights or the natural order is self-evidently true means that the person who's asserting that is saying that their opponent already knows that the natural law is true, and then therefore must be actively denying it for whatever reason, such as they're being malicious, or they're self-motivated to discredit the idea of natural law. And it leads you down this path of not being able to engage, like, in a what would you say, in a good faith discussion with somebody who disagrees with you, because you're already assuming that the thing that you believe is self-evident, therefore the other person must have ill intent in not acknowledging the self-evident truth of your claim. And so what Popper's saying is, no, there's no self-evident truth. All knowledge is conjectural, including this particular thing. And if you're going to conjecture something like natural law, you actually have to explain it. You actually have to say, like, take me as an idiot and assume I can't see the self-evident truth, and please explain it to me. Like what do you mean, and why is it better than such a, like, a quote unquote unnatural law? And so I feel like I'm inclined to kind of want to agree with them that, like, voluntary human interaction without violence and contracts and stuff leads to an emergent order, and that sort of society would be better than one where there's a state that's threatening violence or is able to threaten violence and so forth. But there's, like, at least to me, there's, like, this disconnection there, and nobody I've read has, like, filled in that. It's all very hand-wavy. But I like that you said, Gabe, that, yeah, on some level it's like instinctual. It's like an act of faith on there. They're just like, yeah, yeah, sure, why not?
It feels good.
It feels good.
But it's a major weakness of this book, and I think of libertarianism in general, where they do go a bit too homo economicus, in that, sure, people absolutely do try to act in their best interest, or what they think are their best interests, but they totally disregard I suppose they would call it irrational. I think it's not quite that simple, but the power of intense belief and intense feeling of tribal belonging and the desire to subjugate other people who aren't like you, that is functioning in basically every human being to some extent. And people like Hoppe just act like it's some sort of distortion of how things naturally act, whereas I think that's, at least if you look at human history, that's pretty reliably present all the time. Like, people's desire to get into groups where they feel some sort of belonging and then go and fuck up some other group for basically the reasons of they're not like us. And I feel like much of the time acquiring resources is secondary to just exerting your violent will over someone else. That's just what happens. There's just something people like doing.
It's definitely a feature. The other thing is, like, it's a feature of history, and, like, even today, that,
like, as a species, we just keep doing it.
But, like, violent warlords take power, and that seems like a fairly natural part of human society. Like, as far back as, like, Hammurabi's code, it's like, well, how did Hammurabi get his goddamn power? It's probably because he knew how to organize his militia more potently than his opponents and took power.
Yeah, and it was actually Gabe talking about Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. It's, why did the Bolsheviks win? It's not because they were offering people, some, like, Pareto's superior position. It's, no, they were really good at organizing violence. Yeah. So I want to agree with them. I wish that somebody would come along and fill that God-shaped hole in my heart for libertarians.
Well, it's the leap of faith. It's Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
It's either
It's a leap of faith just to become a full-blown anarcho-capitalist.
Yeah, it literally is either or. At any point, any belief system, you either have to just come to the point of either or, believe yes or no. It is that fundamentally that wager. You have to press one button at the end of the day, and that's where libertarianism kind of failed. And it was basically Anglo economic theory. Even with John Locke, Christianity is built into John Locke's theory of it's
that's very explicitly in John Locke as well. It's like, why do you own your body? It's because of maker's right. It's because God, like, why can't you have slaves? Well, God made everyone, and so everyone is God's property, and you can't take God's property.
Unless he beat them in a war. He actually makes an exception for war slaves, if I recall correctly.
War is cool.
Yeah, the need to chimp, the need to, there's a reason why you never have to teach a 2-year-old toddler how to use a stick, right? They'll instantly know.
That's a self-organizing phenomenon.
They know how to fuck people up. Yeah. So I guess so if we get back to what we were talking about before, like some of the key ideas. So I'm going to quickly say a couple of the other ones. One of them is democracy. Oh no, I'll start off with monarchy. So he uses monarchy in a way that most people wouldn't. But I guess for the purpose,
he acknowledges that it's a spectrum. Like, I'll preempt what you're going to say, but
he says that monarchy is okay. So you've got the state, right? This territorial monopoly on the use of aggression and the ability to create laws and tax the residents of that territory. Then you've got different types of states, and broadly speaking, if you divide those states in those categories, the types of states into two major categories. The first one is does the sovereign privately or publicly own the assets of the state? And if it's a state of private ownership, that's a monarchy. And if it's a state of public ownership, that's a democracy. And so, in particular, the key difference that brings about is that the sovereign or the ruler, if it's a monarchy and they have private ownership, they benefit from the increase in value of the capital of the society, whereas because they're the owner, they're the private owner. Whereas under a democracy, you don't have private ownerships over public goods. You have caretakers who have short time preferences because of the election cycles and so forth, and they don't actively benefit from the increase in the capital value of public goods. All that they can do is, in a short amount of time, try to get what they can out of their positions. And that private public ownership of goods by the state is like the kind of bright line between democracy and monarchy. Did you have anything you want to add, Gabe?
Well, with that, I would say implicit in that within a democracy is that it is a implicit, cold internal civil war, right? Because the rights of it's internal cold civil war, because the reason you see this in a good example what Moldbug likes to use is actually the American Civil War. You will see, especially if you read the newspapers, northern newspapers, the most radical northern newspapers, and the southern newspapers. Basically, immediately after the 13 colonies were established, there was like what we would call a flame war, a troll war between these two. And the thing is, they would constantly double down. It's a basically. It's kind of this mad situation, mutually assured destruction, where the starting point, people are willing to compromise to a certain degree. But then the radicals on, let's say, the North would found John Brown, and he goes on a killing spree in the South. And the first person he kills is actually a free black guy, by the way. And of course, they can't say, well, you know what, he made a mistake. No, shit, I can't do that because of partisan brain. If I admit that we fucked up as abolitionists and we actually end up killing more black people than we helped, that will make the South more eligible in the public eye. That will give them the more votes, and in their version of the democratic long-going democracy, that'll make us look bad. So we can't. So we have to double down. But the problem with partisan democracies is that with interest groups, it has perverse incentive structures where you can't admit that you are wrong, because if you admit you are wrong, they take an extra step towards you. It's game theory, basically, to a certain degree. You can't take a step back because you know for a fact they'll take a step forward. So you're kind of, it's a game of chicken. You either have to accelerate or swerve. And swerve, in this case, in a brain of democracy, swerving equals death. Well, in a game of monarchy, if you notice, monarchs tend to treat warfare, he says this in the book, warfare is a lawsuit, basically. It's lawfare, if you will. You say Frederick the Great versus Mary Teresa with, I forget the name of the place, but it's the south of Prussia. There, you have a lawsuit, and the thing is, these are potential marriage partners. The thing with it's the whole incestuous, a certain level of incestuous family. It's Europe is one big game of The Bachelor, right? It's just, but since you know for a fact that not only you, again, time preference, your son, your great-grandson, your daughter, this is a potential, and right now we're in conflict in multiple times in history of, let's say, Silicon Valley. Company A sues Company B, big territorial war, basically, for a certain patent or a certain lawsuit for a certain product. 10 years later, they're having a merger, or 10 years they're working on cooperating on something else, right? The logic of the Silicon Valley law firm also applies to monarchy, is total war, or which they would say total enmity, total destruction of the enemy, makes no sense. Because yet again, the king barely has control. It is a relation between him, is contract basically between him and his aristocrats. The more land you have, the more potential allies your aristocrats have that gang up on you, basically. There's a reason why, Hoppe mentions this with cities. The more prosperous a city and the more developed the city is, the more likely it is that they are to rebel, right? Because the king's best monopoly is in land. But with a city, cities tend to have intrinsically their own nomos, basically. They tend to bend the reality around them to a certain degree. And so with kings can found cities, Peter the Great founded, of course, St. Petersburg, but to maintain cities is much more hard because it's centralized capital. And the thing is, it can generate its own elites. With kings, they pick out their elites. Yeah.
Interesting.
But since people compete, a city is what Spancher would say, as he calls it, an IQ shredder, right? It's hyper, right? Because city's main productive economic is not manual labor. You're not farming in a city for the most part. A city is taking the manual labor from the countryside and taking that product into the city. And it's all about abstraction. The city lives in abstraction. It abstracts the base materials of the world around it, and it turns it into a quote-unquote economical produce. Banking, merchandise, double book accounting, which is a major development in economics. Stuff like this. It's fundamentally abstraction. And to quote Schmidt, the idea of lawyers. The problem with lawyer, Hoppe says this in the book as well. If you were to negate, the only reason why the state exists is because all bureaucrats would lose their jobs. Much like no matter how much you debate Keynesians and prove them wrong, you can't debate someone out of a belief structure that they benefit from. Really, on a deep level, they benefit from. So
I think Nassim Taleb said something like, it's almost impossible for somebody to change their beliefs if their paycheck depends on their beliefs.
And that's exactly right. And that's exactly right. And Schmidt says something very similar. He says this is during an IRL interview when he was in his late 60s or 70s, he says the problem with being a lawyer, the lawyer in itself is the conflict between a lawyer, a preserver of the law, and a revolutionary. Right, because the potential, because legitimacy. He also talks about the difference between a bandit. Why is fiat currency not considered counterfeit, even though it clearly is a counterfeit scheme for all intents and purposes? It's because the government has legitimacy. Why can a lawyer fundamentally have the quote unquote right to rebel? Is because a king can't. A sovereign has to at some point give up a piece of his power. A king can't be everywhere at once. So the foundational role of a lawyer is listen, you're my second in command. You have the legitimacy to make and create laws and to make decisions on these exceptions. You're the exception handler. And built in within the role of a lawyer is, oh, I can interpret law. Well, can I interpret the foundational law that you yourself are the boss that gives me the law? In reality, I can convince everyone else that what I'm saying is fundamentally more correct than you. It's built in. The role of the lawyer is the revolutionary. Schmidt says this. And built in within the city is the political capital to overthrow the usual shtick, what we mentioned earlier about the three estates, is that the way a king keeps control of his nobles is that he could use the peasants' grievances against taxes and say, oh, that's not my fault. That's actually your baron's fault. You know, the guy who cheated me in cards last week? You know, I give full consent for peasants to rebel this week, right? The city can use that. He says this in the book as well with ethnic groups or sexual groups or even rebelling against a child over the parents. And, you know, we originally had this recording on November 6th, the day after the election. Yeah, which would have been very fitting. And a good example of this, to use a real world example of this, is, you know, the problem with democracy is that it instigates conflicts, or, you know, very similar to Spangel's bio-Leninism theory, is that democracy fundamentally is built on resentment. It's built on interest groups. Because if you don't have a problem, like the reason why he also says the Democrats don't care if the smart leave. The smart can provide for themselves. They're not going to hire me. The whole point of a state is to quote unquote solve problems. If you can solve your own problems, I'm kind of out of a job. However, if you are reliable, if you're a criminal, well, guess what? You're in a box. You're in a jail cell. I can offer you something. I can offer you outside the box. I can offer you the ability to commit crime. I can condone your high type preference behavior so I can benefit from it. And that's the issues with cities, for example. It is an engine. Cities, in a lot of ways, are like nuclear energy. It provides high energy. It's very, very productive, but it's also extremely volatile in terms of politics. Because you can see this in terms of birth rates. Cities are notoriously, this is part of the IQ shredder problem. Sir Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, also brought this up. Which, Hoppe, he basically is a eugenicist. You know, instead of saying dysgenics, which means degradation of genes, he says what? Genetic pauperism? The degradation.
Yeah, he talks about genetic trash, genetic pauperization.
Yes, which is clear as day, just a libertarian slang version of dysgenics and eugenics, right? of the blending in all these different crowds, and the problem with democracy as well is that the meaning crisis, right? This idea of belief, is that you see when you go to university is in a lot of ways, let's be honest, a secular church. People have their most foundational moments. People lose their virginity. People meet their lovers. Most relationships are made in, let's say, college, for example. In a lot of ways, it is more foundational to the average American or average Western person's culture than their local church. And the problem with that is that and the reason why with the blogosphere, why was it that, you know, the manosphere, biological determinism, right, or hardcore track Catholicism or libertarianism, is that a libertarian sees Keynesian economics, thinks about it for 5 seconds, and realizes, man, a fucking squirrel has a better understanding of economics than this dude. But yet his life is better than mine. I can't get a good book deal, and that's the problem. There's this wonderful line from Erich Hahn's book where his sister says, your life is a refutation of your beliefs, which is it's basically just an appeal to culture hegemony, right? You can easily say that to an Austrian, because in American culture, being a gold bug or loving gold is very boomer. It's low class. Being into Bitcoin is a lot of cringe. You're not going to be very sexually successful by being a big Bored Ape fan with your NFT collection. You know what I mean? Oddly enough, Bitcoin. Yes, exactly. It's exactly right. All these beliefs are in a high time preference society, being into biological determinism, being into cryptocurrency, being into religion, because the whole point of religion is a concept of the end, or you get the whole concept of what happens after I die. In a high time preference society with high time preference values and with a perverse incentive structure, if you have any of these beliefs, any one of these three radical quote unquote right beliefs, you have no ways of actually engaging with the world. You are siloed by default. And because you instinctively have a low time preference instinct, because yet again, we talked about this before, it's instinctual. Low time preference is an instinct. And that's how you came to blogosphere. And these people found each other for the first time, despite the fact that we all have extremely different beliefs. We all have something that we are surrounded by a high time preference. We're surrounded by an alien world. There's this country song. There's this, to go full Southern American with you. There's this wonderful country song. When you lose your one and only, there's always room here for the lonely. And and that was the internet fundamentally. Was there's always room here for the lonely in the early days of the internet. And the most lonely people are the people with the most lowest time preference. It's almost loneliness by default in a lot of ways. Because high time preference, it's all about being easily excited by what's in front of you. Being alone is in a lot of ways lonely. Because even in Rousseau, the reason why Rousseau is alone in the island is if he was too busy, if there was a woman on there, he'd be too busy chasing tail than rather catching fish. There's a reason why the Austrians always presume a single individual or bare minimum 2 individuals. There's always the rationale of a single human being. Loneliness is kind of built into the theory in a lot of ways.
Plus, it's almost like an extreme version of the 3-body problem, which is like, basically it's essentially impossible to make accurate predictions about the interactions of, say, like 3 colliding billiard balls or atoms or whatever, let alone the number of collisions that actually take place in the world. It's probably not impossible, it's intractable. I guess there were 2 other terms that I wanted to quickly note, which he doesn't really bring up in this book as much, but it's from his other book, which I found really informative, which is his comparison of socialism versus capitalism. And I think it plays in really importantly to like the rest of like the entire discussion of democracy. He basically says that capitalism is a system in which private property and private property rights are protected, and free association between individuals is protected, and free exchange between individuals and people are protected, where that property right is like exchange based on contracts and consents and so forth. Whereas socialism is a social order in which there is, quote unquote, I think it says something to the effect of institutional aggression against private property and private property rights, including like arbitrary constraints and changing impositions on private property owners, limitations on exchange and prohibition on exchange by third parties who, in particular the state, who are not involved in the exchange, and artificial limitations on free association, again by a third party who isn't involved in the association. And so that idea that capitalism is essentially a system in which, a social order in which there's protection of private property rights, and socialism is a social order in which there is institutionalized aggression against private property rights.
And in that are probably 2 really important things, or one really important thing and one subordinately important thing that I'm going to throw out there, and then sort of I feel like you and I, Levi, acting as the riverbed for Gabe's free-flowing association of ideas. We'll throw those in. Let Gabe go.
I hope I'm giving you material. I'm trying my best. I'm getting engaged.
We're getting the Gabe experience and conveying the Gabe experience to listeners. And if people want more of this, listen to the Sidebar podcast, Tuki's Mag Sidebar.
I never get to do theory on the Sidebar. We always do fiction. Cap is a pure fiction cell. So when I ever get to do theory, I'm like an autistic puppy. I just can't get enough.
So the most important thing within what Levi said that I'm going to throw out to you, Gabe, is this idea of public versus private law, where Hoppe says this is a major problem with democracy. So you've got his idea of conservatism, of natural order, which is referring to these unchanging aspects of reality. And intrinsic within this is this idea of he calls it private law. So private law is basically contracts made between individuals in conditions without a state. And these private laws, because they're existing without a state, because they're voluntary associations between individuals, are going to in some way reflect this perennial order, which is at the basis of Hoppe's idea of conservatism. This is and so these are going to actually be fairly similar laws, even though they're being mediated between many different individuals. They're going to converge or tend to cluster on these unchanging aspects of the natural order. And someone like a prince or a monarch is going to exist more or less as a caretaker of these laws, or someone who unearths and maintains these laws. This is contrasted in this book with public law or legislation, which is basically where you get a state, a democratic state, that gives to itself the ability to say what is right or wrong within its borders. So it makes up what you're allowed to do or what you're not allowed to do with your private property, which includes your body, given that you own your body. And he says that, I guess the most important aspect of this, or maybe there are two important aspects of why public law is so corrosive and why it's so bad. And actually, no, all of this converges on time preference. The biggest problem with this is that it raises time preference, because if you know that the law, what you're allowed to do with your property, can change at any time based on the whims of successive caretaker governments in a democracy, your time preference is going to go up, because if you've got something that you could consume now that at any moment you know could just be taken away arbitrarily by the state, you're going to be more inclined to consume it sooner rather than later, or put it off to put towards capital goods or saving, something like that. So what Levi said got me thinking about the difference between public and private law for Hoppe and how important it is, and why democracy ruins it, basically.
I see you're taking, well, I guess in that case, monarchy is the purple color, so you're taking the purple pill now. You first took the red pill, you're finally taking the purple pill. You're taking the patrician pill.
Regal purple pill.
Regal purple, yeah. Noble purple.
Well, I mean, the conflict between, well, again, is the idea of that the intrinsic paranoia of that Civil War, that Cold War mindset, is that, when rights are up for debate, or when rights are up to subjugation of change, or even culturally believed rights, for example. A good example of this is actually, not to get topical or anything, is are y'all familiar with the 4B movement, by the way?
Peripherally, yeah. It's a strange roundabout way to intense sexual conservatism.
Yes, it's female-oriented, high time preference behavior, deeply, and openly so. So in South Korea, it was a South Korean phenomenon. Basically, 4Bs in South Korean, all these words start with a B. So like no sex, no marriage, no children, no men, basically. And they would say, yes, I know that with the birth rate's low, and yes, I know this fundamentally would collapse our civilization. I don't care, and they have they have justifications, casus belli, and all these things, and it was a purely South Korean thing, because this is actually a political movement of ideology. This is a genuine ideology. This is this is the inverse of the power of the pussy. You know what I mean? This is the dark enlightenment of the power of the pussy, right? Their version of it, and you see this in a good example of this is from the American context is, of course, a conflict with the Roe versus Wade. For the last, I think, 50 years or so, abortion was considered a unilateral right. And yet again, I don't care what your personal beliefs is. It's a mechanical description of the politics in place. Then you see the paranoia of this, because this right, which a large segment of the American population believe is a right, is potentiality of being taken away. Well, it's being up to the states, but even then, when it's universal to 50, because the problem is we're so used to not leaving it up to the states since 1870, we have this weird thing, everything has to be universal, everything has to be flat, right? laws are interchangeable. Not only, the worst thing is laws can change and laws apply everywhere all at once at the same time, right? So the fact that you can't say no to this change, okay, this change at least aspect, I at least can ignore that change. No. In a democracy, you are always a potential partisan. You're always a potential combatant.
All voice, no exit.
Yes, exactly. You can't ignore it.
Yeah, right.
Like, you have to participate.
Right, and in Hoppe's conceptualization, these are the reasons why the network state, or the city-state structure of Germany before the German Empire, is that you have multiple cities. North is Protestant, South is Catholic, and this is the inverse. The more powerful, the more secure a power feels, for example, a king, the less likely he is to impinge on your freedoms. It sounds bizarre, but to justify this, the fear of factionalism comes from the potentiality of being overthrown or potentially being killed. A good book for this is actually a book Molotov Remembers. Molotov was one of the founding quote-unquote fathers of the Russian Revolution, lived all the way to 1980. And his wife was thrown in jail. He was almost killed for quote-unquote factionalism, basically being you disagreed with Stalin line. And he justified it, saying if factionalism were to break out, the very foundation of safety, it's pure Hobbesian. If Stalin was the only thing keeping the Soviet Union together, if we somehow doubt Stalin, then all war of all against all, basically. And the potential with a king, contrast this to Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was known for his very famous saying, he was asked, why do you have such free speech? Because Prussia had actually one of the most lax freedom of speech laws in the entirety of Europe at the time. He said, basically, they say what they want, I do what I want. The common dig at Prussianism is that, it's true, because the common dig at Prussia is that, it's an army without a state. It's backwards. The fact that you have the army first, the fact you have, again, the most primary concern is being killed or physical violence. If you have that 100% or the closest thing to 100% safety, if you're Frederick the Great and you know for a fact that you're completely safe, why do you care if some of your subjects are Catholic? It's the same thing with the Ottoman Empire, with the fact they did not force convert all of their subjects. They even force integration. Jewish sections of the Ottoman Empire were allowed to have Jewish laws and to serve only Jewish people, except, of course, the exception being any Ottoman bureaucrat. They get to go anywhere, right? There's the classic, I'm the state, I get to infringe upon that. I am the one exception, right? The sovereign always gets the exception. The operating layer gets to operate no matter the cause. So the problem with democracy is that the potential for conflict is built in, and you never know when it's going to happen, and every potential capable of grouping, sex, gender identity, all these things can be spontaneously picked up and thrown away, right? The classic case of, why don't the left represent labor and they're more focused around identity politics, quote unquote, one of the interesting things about NRX was that a big controversy at the time of the old days, Spandra got a lot of heat for this, is that, nationalism is a very, very old leftist weapon. You wash off the rust, you have to realize fundamentally nationalism was a leftist weapon. You see how the German monarchy reacted to this. They saw, when Bismarck was advising Kaiser Wilhelm I, Kaiser Wilhelm, it was during 1848, I recall correctly, he said, Wilhelm was like, I can go to the Reichstag. I can argue for my right as a king. And of course, Bismarck was like, are you high? Like, they're not, you can't argue this part. The whole point of the Reichstag was to slowly get power away from you. You can't argue. It has to be a priori thing. You're a Kaiser because you are the Kaiser, right? And Bismarck said, his mind was flooded with the brown, gold, and red colors. He basically says it's basically the gay flag in reactionary German terms. And it's a very awkward thing in most right-wing politics is that the genealogy of nationalism, it was clear as day a leftist tactic. Lenin,
French Revolution.
Yeah, obviously, it's very awkward. It's very a lot of rightists kind of struggle to peg that hole, and that's the big problem with democracy is that you never know what grouping Hoppe talks about this. It puts man against wife. The whole point of democracy, at the end of the day, it's an acid. It slowly melts away all bonds and slowly puts the potentiality of conflict into every subcategory, including the family. Literally, Social Security, in a lot of ways, is putting the elders against the youth. right? Because not only is it the incentive of growing old is to, again, like a squirrel, you also harvest for the internal winter years of your life. With Social Security, you don't have to, take care of yourself in the future, and you're putting on an unnecessary burden on not your children, which at least there's some biological component to that, and some, children are biologically predisposed to take care of you in your elderly age. It's all the youth of the entire nation has to take care of the elderly, and the incentive structure of all that is completely backwards. And so that's why, at the end of the day, democracy, the famous line from Marx and Engels is that families are fundamentally bourgeois, or that the family must be destroyed. It's fundamentally oppressive. At the end of the day, democracy doesn't say that, but implicit within the Moore's law of democracy, we can say, or the logic train of Moore's law or of democracy, is fundamentally that it can even go within the intrinsic family structure. The potentiality of making your own parents, your children, your spouse a partisan is built in within the potentiality of democracy. So paranoia and democracy are intertwined. There's always going to be paranoia within democracy, at least for the monarchy. With North Korea, as if the rules are at least bright red lines, listen, I have to make sure I spit shine my beautiful picture of dear leader Kim Jong-un. That's a very clear red line. And as long as I pay my taxes, again, it's still under a libertarian point of view. That's still fundamentally a thievery, but it's a clear red line of thievery. If I hit green button, I get a treat. It's pure Pavlovian dog. I hit a red button, I get hit. Okay, don't hit the red button. Right? The more secure an authoritarian regime is, and the more secure an authoritarian regime feels, the more freedom it can allow. It's a hard logic to kind of really wrap your head around, but you look at it from the POV of a state and human beings as either a capital or a pathogen, it makes sense from the state's POV. And you take the POV of the state. It can, much like a child, if you have a good relationship with your son and he's out past 2 hours past bedtime, whatever, like, oh, he met a girl. I know he's not doing anything crazy. You can allow that sense of trust. If you have a paternal sense of government, you can allow that sense of trust. If your child tends to misbehave, you're not going to allow them to pay 2 hours past their bedtime, because there's going to be a potentiality of conflict. So because Frederick the Great, or any good solid king, an absolutist king, has a good relationship with his he has a paternal relationship with his subjects, the sense of trust that goes both ways can allow for more, oddly enough, a higher level of social trust and social freedom, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I don't know whether or not this is true, but so I hear, that whether it's already started happening or we're in a transition period where Western countries like the United States are, for the first time in known human history, experiencing a reversal of generational wealth transfer, where instead of wealth flowing down from the older generation to the younger generation because of I guess in particular, like the pension system, but also healthcare. There's actually like now becoming a net transfer from younger people to older people, which is, if that's true, pretty concerning.
I guess it's we're running the experiment. We'll see what happens. I mean, for whatever predictions are worth, my guess is it's just going to result in default. Like,
a whole bunch of defaults, yeah,
just stop paying it eventually.
Yeah,
right. It would still lead to severe social chaos, because the problem is you get an
default equals social chaos.
Yeah, you get
it's not comfortable.
There's a reason why in Dark Nick Land talks about that is it's zombie apocalypse. It basically is zombie apocalypse. You know what I mean? Because another layer.
You know that a government can't default on their debts because they can just print as much money as they need to meet their obligations. So
keep making more money.
Doesn't matter. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right. Oh, okay, but that's the thing. When the hard reality is that, despite that fact, is that reality of population numbers. This is also why immigration is brought up here. Is that you get what's called an hourglass shape. The most people who produce the most taxes are people in their middle ages, like 20 to 40. The problem is they're paying not only for the elderly, they also have to pay for the next generation. That's also constantly shrinking. So you're getting them in a double bind, basically. Where
they fix that problem by not having the next generation.
Isn't the welfare state great? Isn't it great? Isn't all?
I'm one of the smooth brains who's actually reproduced, so I'm making the problem worse.
Actually, well, technically speaking, you're more likely to reap the rewards the more offspring you have. But technically speaking, they eventually will join the Mannerbunds, and they'll eventually join the war bands. And we get to culturally reset. And, they can become steppe warriors and conquer the infertile low pockets of civilization all over again.
Okay, so as in my role as the riverbed for Gabe's flowing river of interlinked thoughts, how about I throw this one out? So, where to go from here? Do you want to talk about intolerance, immigration, or private defense? How about we start with intolerance and egalitarianism, because that's so much of this book, the tension between egalitarianism and private property, which he really hammers. So he's one of the really inflammatory ideas in this book that I actually don't see talked about much when people talk about this book, which sort of surprised me, was how he basically says that you've almost got an ethical obligation to maximize intolerance, which I really enjoyed, because it's just living in a liberal democratic society. That's one of the most extreme things you can basically say in terms of our Overton window. Like, if you think of the Overton window as the size of your desk, this particular idea is out in the Kuiper Belt. So what he's basically saying is Hoppe really seems to think that allocating resources efficiently, which involves low time preference, is an ethical good. I don't think he says it quite so explicitly, but in this book, it's strongly implied that this is an ethically good thing to do. This is what you should be doing. It's an ought. It's an ought, not just an is, because it's reflective of natural order, of the natural order, and because something is natural and it's libertarianism, it's just good. So when you've got people allocating their private property in an efficient way, what does that involve? Well, it involves discrimination. It's like, I'm discriminating between a better and a worse, or a more or less profitable use of my resources. That includes time. He basically just extends this out to, okay, well, you've got some people who are they're just not as good. And what do you do with these people? Well, you should be discriminating against them, because there are higher value people you could be putting your resources towards, or you could be letting into your gated community, defended by your insurance company, and so on. From his idea of allocating your resources, your private property, rationally, effectively, and profitably, he gets to, not only should you be discriminating, you've got to be maximizing your discrimination, which means you've got to be maximizing your intolerance for, he calls them alternative lifestyles. You've got to be intolerant. You've got to be as intolerant as you can be as a real libertarian. It's a Gabe or Levi. Do you want to jump off from that?
Actually, I'm curious, Levi, what's your thoughts on that, basically? Because it's the most stereotypical, like, again, it's the first principle of libertarianism is the ability to say no to the state. And this is the maximalization of that belief.
Yeah,
it's the ultimate no.
As far as he can.
Yeah.
I didn't interpret it as prescriptive necessarily, because he did say that he quoted Rothbard when he said something to the effect of, actually, under this social structure, you'd have an immense amount of diversity. You'd have lots of small communities with their own local laws, customs, and so forth, each of which would be able to discriminate, include or exclude people based on like their preferences. And I think, at least my interpretation was like, the sort of community that he would like to live in is one that is libertarian and has like quote unquote traditional family values, and if somebody wants to have an alternative lifestyle, they keep it within like their own private domain, like keep it within the four walls of their own house, but don't actually display it in public. Or such a community would alienate and eventually exclude people like that from their community. However, because it's libertarianism and you'd have this diversity of ethnic communities or religious communities or communities based on whatever criteria, each one of those communities would be highly discriminatory with regards to inviting people in, allowing people to join the community, and so forth, but able to engage with one another through mutually beneficial exchange based on their own self-interest, knowing that the division of labor allows like increasing productivity. So you have this like comparative advantage in engaging with these other communities, even if you don't want to like live with them socially, or whatever. And so I was thinking of it more like he was describing what would happen under such a system, under his reasoning. And for libertarians, according to his definition of libertarians, they would want to have this sort of community where they exclude.
So one way to square this, I think, could be bringing in his idea of secession, so exit. So it's within a community, given that the community is based on some sort of exclusivity. Within the community, there will be a high degree of intolerance. Intolerance against whatever that community is formed in opposition to. So even if you have the anything goes libertine community, well, there's still going to be intolerance towards people who don't share the doing heroin and having sex with children strain of their particular libertinism. So maybe it is like within a community high intolerance with respect to other communities kind of indifference.
Or the ability to deal impartially with them for the purposes of like economic exchange. And I thought this idea was interesting. If you put aside modern sentiments in a place like Australia of
I would say the universalism in Australia of everyone needs to be a Liberal Democrat.
But also just like, I don't know, like not being homophobic and not being racist and stuff. Whereas like what people like Rothbard and like Hoppe are saying is like, no, that's a private issue. The state shouldn't have anything to do with it. If a shop owner wants to not engage in trade with somebody for whatever reason, or somebody doesn't want to rent their house on whatever grounds, because it's their private property, they should be allowed to do it. And the fact that the state is like creating these restrictions and constraints and edicts about how a property owner can use their property and the reasons why, it's violating their property rights. And so if you take away the state, or if you had a state that actually respected the full consequences of maximal property right protection, you would have people by their own judgment starting to discriminate based on those sorts of grounds and other grounds. Like maybe they use this one funny example where it's like, a business owner might only want to employ like 6'4" albinos, and they will suffer the consequences of that discrimination. And another business owner might not have any of those biases, and that's great for them. But the state shouldn't step in and tell somebody what to do with their own property, whether it's like who you invite into your house, who you do business with, who you let rent your property, and so forth. And he's saying like an emergent behavior or an emergent phenomena that he would expect from actually implementing full private property rights would be that people would start segregating and or that there would be some segregation. Maybe not everybody would segregate, but there would be some segregation and discrimination along the lines of things like ethnicity or religion or politics or whatever it is. And to be honest, like I wouldn't be surprised. It's, like we won't find out unless we run the experiment where there is actually some place on Earth where there is like pure capitalism or something close to pure capitalism, but and like pure private property rights with like a minimal or no state. But if that experiment ever actually gets run, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some degree of what Hoppe's describing, which is like self-selecting discrimination and intolerance and so forth. I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, yeah, people like people who are more similar to them.
Yeah,
that's not a groundbreaking insight, and so it's he really it's that combination of private property plus his idea of exit, which I guess is implicit in his idea of private property.
Yeah,
would, probably lead to that sort of emergent behavior.
Yeah, and whether or not it's a good thing, I suppose, is like somewhat irrelevant. I guess within his frame of, he's just saying like, no, what matters is private property, and that individuals can self-determine who they interact with, who they associate with, who they exchange with, what they do with their property, and not having a third party arbitrarily interfere with that is what's important, and let people decide for themselves how they're going to live. And so it really requires like a degree of like dispassion almost to like just to consider what he's saying. Like you need to be not try to like separate your own preferences from a more abstract sense of ethics. Is like this ethic actually transcends like parochial considerations, like whether or not you want to discriminate based on religion, or whether whether like the next person down is going to discriminate based on religion. Like that's completely beside the point. It's like the individual's right to self-determine their own life, what they do with their property, and how they associate with other people. That is what matters.
It's being an idealist.
Off point. Oh, sorry, go on.
That's very idealist.
Yeah, it's total commitment to your ideal. And Rothbard's a great example of this. There's a great story, and when I think he was a Yale student in 1948. He formed a club called the States' Rights Club, Students for, I think, Thurmond. And Thurmond was a states' rights advocate in the South, and of course that's intrinsically tied to certain. Again, the issue of slavery and racism is intrinsically tied to that rhetoric in America, at least. So it was Rothbard, a New York Jew, a bunch of Southern students, and about 15 to 20 leftists extremely scared about why is there a Thurmond group inside their college. You know what I mean? The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And and Rothbard was always being accused of being a self-hating Jew because of this. And Rothbard was like, dude, he basically said, I don't care. I can make my own club. I'm confident enough in a state. I don't need a state to basically trick me into thinking I own something or I'm invited to something when I know I'm not. You know what I mean? He basically has... Another aspect of this is you have to be dedicated to your ideals and also an unshakable confidence, almost an irrational. Yes, honestly, it comes from this idea of self-reliance. You have to be you can autistically have a self-belief of being capable of providing for your own self. Yeah, again, not even relying on necessarily even family relations or ethnic relations or tribal relations. This is a level of confidence that goes beyond even tribe. It's a very, very, I'd say, a psychological mutation to a certain degree. When Jonathan Haidt has this idea called moral foundations, and it's the idea of certain belief structures are intrinsic to certain people. Some say it's hereditary, at least to a certain degree, political beliefs are hereditary. So, right-wing personality people, even in the Soviet Union, one example would be hardcore Stalinists. But if you got that same person and put them into Reagan America, they'd be hardcore Reaganites, right? It's right-wing by, of course, their cultural standard, but to a certain degree, there's no such thing as a right-wing personality, a left-wing personality, and of course, a libertarian personality, and of course, the moral foundation position for libertarians is a notorious level of self-centeredness. Not necessarily like negative this way, but all of libertarian logic is very much of the relationship of a person. I will do this. I'm capable of doing this. It very much is, you said non-biasedly, self-centered. Do a very, very, again, the Randian ideal, the heroic individual. You know what I mean? The myth of the libertarians is the Galt's Gulch. You know what I mean? With the cool floating golden. Yeah, it's exactly right. You know what I mean? It's that. And they defended with the sonic nuke or whatever the hell that was. Like, it's that fantasy, right? And again, Rothbard either dated Rand or used to be with Rand, but and it is a problem of Rand. If you want to be in a Rand,
definitely licked her toes at one point. For sure.
Yeah,
100%.
Rothbard, absolutely. I could see him being a toes guy.
Sucked his toes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely.
Hop is way too much of Stone Cold. Hoppe was a true cell when he was younger.
He's above all of that.
He's
for unprotected sex is too high time preference for him.
It's true, actually, and this is the other aspect of HBD. Actually, is like fun fact. Actually, people with high IQs have they kiss less often. They're less likely to have premarital sex. They just have less children in general. Actually, high IQs actually associate less with fertility, which is a aspect of it's a way to cope with the fact that you're a virgin, but I'm too smart to have sex.
Copium, a natural. God damn, I'm blanking so hard right now. Contraceptive. Copium,
the copium
contraceptive. Yeah.
The copium contraception. That's actually a banger title.
Yeah. Some of the interesting. There's a lot. There's obviously a lot. I guess with regards to secession, one of the interesting things is he talks about von Mises' idea of democracy originally being about self-determination, autonomy, and so forth, and that under von Mises and older classical liberals' idea of democracy, secession and the right, well, on an individual level, the right to exit, so emigration, is an inherent right and shouldn't be opposed by the state, by the democratic state. And on a collective level, secession of a particular community shouldn't be opposed or interfered with if by plebiscite or whatever mechanism a particular community says, like, actually we don't want to be part of the state anymore, we want to secede, then it would be consistent for under Mises' idea of democracy for the state in question to peacefully allow that community to secede. However, under modern democracy, that is not the case. Classic example being like Catalonian separatism, to a lesser degree Tasmanian separatism, which I wholeheartedly support.
To a much greater degree Tasmanian separatism.
Yeah, the only problem with Tasmanian separatism is we currently receive a lot of subsidies from the mainland. So
yeah, but if you can print your own currency,
and we have an extremely low like numeracy and literacy rate. But if we can fix those two things, maybe with like hooking up our hydroelectric dams to like Bitcoin miners or something, then like, yeah, definitely we should secede from the mainland. But I found that really interesting because if that's a reasonable idea, then yeah, you can see where Rothbard and Hoppe are coming from. It's like these communities, say the Catalonians or the Texans or whatever, they don't want to be a part of this this federation or this United States of America or the Spanish state or whatever, and yet they're not being allowed to secede. They're not being allowed to like peacefully exit. And in some cases, on an individual level, like with the Americans, if you want to leave, there's an exit tax. And in Australia, there's not an exit tax. However, in Australia, if you want to leave, you can't take your super.
Yeah.
Like your that's like your 401k. That's like your superannuation. You can't. So you save up your 10% or 11% of your earnings over time.
And the government makes you do it.
Yeah, the government makes you do it, and if you decide to emigrate, you can't just take your super with you. So like governments will fuck with you and tax you or like prevent you from taking your property with you if you decide to emigrate. And so it calls into question: well, are these really democratic countries, or are they a sort of soft form of authoritarianism where the ruling bureaucrats and government caretakers are basically regarding the citizenry as cattle, essentially? Like
I think this is
as Saifedean Anamus says, they're collateralizing their government debt with the future earnings of the population.
It's important to distinguish between democracy and liberalism here, it's why it's talking about liberal democracy is better than just saying democracy, at least to refer to our systems, because democracy is basically how you select rulers. It's like, well, you do it by a vote. And of course, there are different degrees of democracy. Say, how many people in a population get to vote? How many get to decide?
Different mechanisms.
It can be 2 people. It can be all male property owners. It can be everyone over the age of 18, and so on. And we have plenty of exclusion in our democracies. Like, we don't let 5-year-olds vote. It's still a choice as to who you enfranchise. So it's that, and then liberalism is its own thing as separate from how do you select rulers. Liberalism comes with its own, say, it centres the individual, this idea of individual autonomy, individual rights.
Private property. Like, the two things are separate. Like, you can have completely illiberal democracies. People... At least some people who like to pretend that our current model of governance is the only model of governance like to pretend that illiberal democracy is somehow incoherent, whereas, like, people can vote for illiberal things. In fact, I think if you just let most people vote on stuff, they're going to end up in a pretty illiberal place, because people just like voting for their own interests.
Right, that's how you get Bonapartism, right? This is from the Machiavellians, right? That's Bukele, basically. The conditions are so bad. I'd rather have one unified warlord, basically, which is what Bukele is.
Yeah, people just like, we're going to elect someone who's going to arrest a bunch of people without trial.
Do you care that he's going to be there till he dies? No, I don't care. I care about walking to the street without getting mugged. Basically, it's the most Hobbesian consideration. He can do whatever he wants. I just want to walk to the park without getting shot. Basically, it's the most it's the most basic criteria of voting for a leader. Basically,
when things are that dire. So, what do you reckon, Gabe, about like secession and emigration, especially as an American, I guess?
Well, I am a much like Nabokov. I'm a European immigrant. I was not born in America. I'm a product of the exit, and much like Hoppe, I have my own nostalgic fantasies about pre-World War I Europe. But America is very, very bizarre. Is that, objectively speaking, as a Zoomer, I'm talking about from the purely normative, my relationship with is the average politically connected Zoomer, there is no sense of nationhood. You know what I mean? The idea of I have a passport, I can go anywhere. I want to live in Japan for a couple of years. I want to live at X, Y, and Z place. You can see, all these tourist videos of people in Japan, to use my mother's words, acting a fool. You know what I mean? It's the idea with liberalism is that Schmidt says, the first one to use the word humanity in an argument is cheating. To universalize an argument, because it implicitly kind of it's the view of being an emperor of the world. Basically, it's like you're fundamentally kind of arguing on other people's behalf when you argue for quote unquote humanity. You know what I mean? And fundamentally, America feels, and even inside, it feels like America is just the microcosm of the world. And so let's say you have this meme about Texit, Texas exit, Texit. Can most of people even point where the Alamo is? I mean, these are quote unquote, these are not rational. Like, do you need to know where the Alamo is or the fight at the Alamo to support Texas exit? Not necessarily, but foundational myths. Again, as we discussed earlier, even libertarians cannot escape quote unquote religion or foundational myths. Private law, discovered law rather than created law. Foundation. Every culture has a sense of symbols. Junger enforced passage. You know what I mean? Every culture needs to have a scalable concept of why are you born, what happens after you die, and why do you live. And myths have this adaptive feature to them. Myths are adaptive. Religion is an adaptation, not a defect. It's not a mutation. It's not a bug. It serves an actual evolutionary purpose, even if you want to go full Darwinist on it. It's an adaptive feature. So as an American, we don't think of succession. We think, Civil War, they want to secede. Why? Slavery. Okay, slavery equals secession. You would only secede if you were a bad person. You want to secede because you want to do bad things, is the extrapolation from that, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
As clearly
Sounds
as...
like a statist mythology to me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, although I do think Levi was making the Straussian argument for himself to become king of Tasmania.
No,
that's not Straussian.
It's very literal. It's extremely literal. I'm not trying to hide behind any sort of.
There's no reading between the lines
language.
here.
No. Levi for king of Tasmania.
Bitcoin Emperor Levi.
Secession.
Tasmania.
Become a hard money monarchy under.
Well, but
No, you get to accumulate the hard money. Everyone else gets paper.
Yeah. I can be like Kubla Khan. I'll just take a little Bitcoin and then make the other Tasmanians use gum leaves or something.
Yeah.
Primitive anarcho-capitalism. PAC, primitive official PAC party, right? And but that's actually it's an interesting thought experiment. Is we have a few select city states like this. Lee Kuan Yew would be example. Yarvin has Monaco. Hoppe has Liechtenstein. I'd say Singapore, El Salvador. I'd say now, and
Hong Kong until it got fucked.
Yeah. Yeah, it got submerged. That's the problem with city-states. They're probably the best form of government by far, is that they're very, very unstable, right? They tend to fall in adaptation in certain degrees. And that's the issue with city-states, is that you can choose. Let's say, for example, you do control Tasmania, right? And let's say, absolute king, you are 100% a Schmittian. No this weird three competing branches that are competing against each other. No, the government's
none of that
body.
Nonsense.
No, 100% Levi. Levi is Tasmania, and Tasmania is Levi.
It's a cultural custom. You come into Tasmania, and you have full rights. The official currency is Bitcoin. All universal currency is Bitcoin in Tasmania. And I'm not even allowed to say.
And everybody has a full-size oil painting portrait of me in their living room. Yeah, that's me.
In front of a squat rack, and every morning they have to do 200 ass to grass squats while looking at Levi's face,
and they have to eat breakfast steaks.
Yeah,
it's eugenic. You're making them more healthy. You're making them adaptive. You're raising your human capital. As a monarch, your people are your capital. You're increasing their value. Your capital stock.
It's for their own good.
Exactly.
Let them eat steak.
But it's actually an interesting thought experiment, right? Because the whole point of authoritarian, let's say, if you were to honestly think from first principles, I have absolute power. I have Elon Musk put a chip in my brain, all military. You have prime robots. You have Tesla robots. So you never have to worry about a coup. You're perfectly safe. You have this island. And as long as the immigration is very clear, you have social standards. Again, revealed preference. There won't be any conflict, quote unquote conflict, or at least conflict will be minimized. Because let's say I want to join Tasmania under this dictatorship. Now, I know the cultural customs. Now, am I allowed to say certain things? Am I allowed to not say certain things? Is there hate speech laws? It all depends on, is it blasphemy to say I want to kill Levi? Most likely it will be blasphemy to say that's considered a threat, even with it's considered at least rude. I should at least be paid a fine in right?
You get fed into the hydroelectric dams for that.
That's a flogging.
a tasteful flogging for my bad behavior. But in reality, what's the difference between that and an HOA fundamentally? Because an HOA, it's very in black and other than it being a little bit of a.
So what's an HOA? Is that an American term?
Homeowners Association. It's
Oh, right. Fuck that.
yeah. So you know how Hoppe has this based idea of like covenant laws in private societies, where if you want to join like a suburb or a community, you had to sign a contract. Imagine
It's
a
just
very
going to be an armed homeowners association.
yeah, a cringe like somehow the
Sounds
HOA.
like hell. It sounds like the worst thing you could possibly do.
Well, I mean, but when you do it in the right way, the problem is with the HOA.
Tasmania gets turned into a giant HOA where Levi's just the chair of the HOA. They're just complete cunt to people.
Right. Well, but the point is, you are at least a clear cunt. You make your cuntness clear in writing, at the very least. There's no distinction between formal power and de facto power. They're 100%. The rules are clear, at least fundamentally clear, and you allow property rights. Much like Frederick the Great, you subjectively value property rights.
Well, I allow myself property rights.
Yeah.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves here.
right. But
Everyone else is just renting the land from Levi.
but productively renting the land for Levi, And the thing is, much like Deng Xiaoping, in China, who's also considered by Yarvin a modern prince, is a Deng Xiaoping. The Chinese miracle is underneath him. Same thing with land, is that yes, at least I'm a selfish bastard. You are going to come in Tasmania, and you're going to be my renters. But I promise you physical safety. I promise you certain libertinism. If you're a Bitcoiner, guess what? You get to use your Bitcoin finally. There's certain social customs and taboos that where you're coming from won't be available here. You can say whatever you want, other than you say you can't kill me. Same thing with Singapore. You can't defame the president. You can say racial slurs as long as not the 3 protected ones in Singapore. You can Nick Land. I mean, Nick Land is a hyper racist and all these things in China, but he is the marketing. He is the China's best cultural ambassador, Nick Land. That man is carrying Chinese mental tourism on his back.
Didn't he write a number of tourist books for Shanghai at some stage as well?
With his wife. He actually is unironically the tourist administration. He is the leading PR. He actually did with his wife. He actually did write a bunch of tourist books for Shanghai. Right? And you can see this, for example. It's an interesting case. China at any point can kill this man. Nick Land acknowledges this. But he, again, subjectively values certain things China gives him more than others. And the problem with authoritarianism isn't necessarily the fact that it's an authoritarian. The problem is the flimsy rulings. As long as the rules are consistent, you can see people subjectively making the choice to live under it. As long as there's exit rights as well.
Yeah, exit's the problem.
Yeah, as long as exit is guaranteed, and as long as rules are clear and exit is guaranteed, a lot of the negative effects of authoritarianism goes along, basically shatters. The fundamental problem is you have to allow a certain level of exit. As long as exit is guaranteed, the disincentive to structures of authoritarianism melts away.
Yeah, no, Tasmania will be a trapdoor function. Once you get here, you are Levi's property.
Yeah, you're getting microchipped.
Yeah.
And that thing's going to turn you into a vegetable as soon as you leave Tasmania. As soon as you go 200 meters offshore.
Just immediately put a shotgun collar on them. Welcome to Tasmania, motherfucker.
It's not cinematic enough. It needs to be explosive at least.
No, you get fed to the sandworms. So they can produce
Tasmanian sandworm.
You get fed to the patty melons. We're going to breed some like carnivorous patty melons. I was thinking that's a good discussion of secession. Tasmania should definitely secede. We've got a couple other interesting.
What about immigration, forced
here.
integration, and private defense are two of the big things I reckon we should hit.
Yeah, immigration for him, it's because you can tell he's kind of putting his firepower to justify. He's like, well, okay, you can allow, as long as people have visitation rights, as long as you literally give you're allowed to come here, mister, from across the border. And even then, he even says, in some cases, because of the disastrous second order effects of having a foreigner in your community. You sometimes have to ask permission of your neighbors. He even says this at certain times, because they're going to be receiving the secondary effects of having this foreigner in. You can't just directly ask this person across the border to come to your house. You have to ask permission from your neighbors, which seems to be a slightly slipping away from Hoppe's consistency. And also,
I guess he would might say that that's an externality where there's a third party being impacted by your action, and that, as he said, as Jack explained earlier about his like first principles, one of the first principles was if the exchange is between two parties and it doesn't have an impact on a third party. But I suppose like the idea of externalities, which he doesn't really talk about in this book, would mean that you have to take into consideration, say, your neighbors for stuff like that.
I think with his immigration, it's worth considering, okay, what's immigration in a state context? What's immigration in a private law society context? In a state context, he calls it forced integration, because he says what a state does is a state just says, okay, this territorial expansion is mine. So I'm talking from the perspective of an abstract state, can do what I want here. And so when a state decides to let someone immigrate into the state, what the state is basically doing is violating everybody's property rights within the state, because now that person, that immigrant, can go wherever they want in the state. Okay, so maybe they can't enter your house, but they can use a road that the state built so that the state can move things around itself more easily. They can go and stand outside your front door. So the state is still, I guess, it's enacting the potential for that immigrant to impose on your private property. This is contrasted with a private law society with Ancapistan, where basically to be on your property, someone needs to make a contract with you, basically. So it's not like they can just use the state road to come up to the front of your house. They need your agreement to interact with your property in any way. And I guess if you live in a gated community, or you've entered into some sort of contract with homeowners or property owners around you, and you've set your own rules on who can or can't enter, that becomes a bit more complicated. He offered suggestions here, like any immigrant or anyone entering into a community needs the agreement of at least one property owner who will then be liable for you when you're in the community. So that's one way of doing it. The simplest way is if you're just some homesteader somewhere off in the wilderness and you say, yes, this person can come onto my property. That's non-forced integration immigration.
Well, I mean, an aspect of this is, the way of, as a side note, I love how creepy he makes government roads. The libertarian fear of the roads.
Yeah, he really doesn't like roads.
And to be fair,
he's very threatened by roads.
Under his POV, it is kind of like an Eldritch Cthulhu kind of thing. Like the state, you're never disconnected from the state in any shape or way or form.
Yeah, it's like we can now get you conveniently at any time.
which actually, fair enough.
To be fair, American roads do suck. True. They really suck. So I can see why he has an issue.
No, but from Hoppe's perspective, the worse the government roads are, the better, because it impairs the government's ability to reach you.
It's harassment architecture. It's harassment architecture.
But just think about it. Your house is accessed via a government road. All private property is bordered by publicly owned, bureaucratically administered, fiat-funded roads, which probably suck. Especially if you're in Arizona. Fucking Arizona's roads suck so much.
Well, no, listen, some roads were built in the 1920s, all right? As long as you stay on those roads, you're safe from the state.
So what were you going to say before, Gabe, before I cut you off about the topic of Ancapistan and the rules on immigration?
Well, no, I would agree with fundamentally with his again. You can see him deploy mental gymnastics. You can see him not necessarily struggle, but okay, I'm glad to put a lot of effort, because the standard libertarian argument is for open borders. That's the hegemonic concern is open borders. So you can tell he's kind of doing his own version of mental gymnastics, trying to argue for his very, very limited form of immigration. And again, him kind of admitting that, yes, you do have to concern your neighbors in this judgment call. And again, this is where he becomes his most right wing, or his most reactionary aspect of him, is that fundamentally foreigners have built in within the concept of foreigner is conflict. He brings up Switzerland, of course, my sweet, sweet homeland, Yugoslavia, baby.
Nice.
Yeah. And the cantons of Switzerland, he says fundamentally all these places degrade into, secessionists. You can force these people to integrate, mass conflict, mass paranoia, mass death, and you only hold it for so long, and then it'll just scatter to the winds anyway. It's ultimately self-defeating. So what Hoppe says is that basically, he also references Shaman Rushdie, I believe, which is not Shaman Rushdie, not the Muslim author. I forget his. He was notoriously a Canadian psychologist who believed in. He was the one who was advocating for idea of human biological diversity or ethnic differences in genetics. Hoppe cites him at one point. Is that Hoppe does believe in ethnic differences, either they be the culturally or genetically, and that's a big. That's the most radioactive part of democracy that got to fail. That's where he really, really pushes the Overton window. Like if you have the Overton window, you have the libertarian bottom and the very right corner, the libertarian corner, and authoritarian right. Their tips are touching basically. He's touching the tip of the corners.
He's turned it into a 3-dimensional political compass.
Yes, that's the power of Hoppe. That's the power of praxeology. It can bend the compass to its will.
Transcendent, breaking the Overton window.
Yeah, that's basically what he does, and that's how he has to justify it. And you can see his devotion to fundamental libertarianism, because I brought this up with the little tariff thing, is that you could justify restrictions of people, but you can't restrict trade. That's why his big bugaboo of Buchanan is tariffs, and that's where I see a contradiction with. And that's the thing I see a contradiction with the Hoppe, is that he says, well, even if it's more economically productive to allow immigrants in, you could subjectively value being away from immigrants more than you do economics. He says this right in he even says, even if technically, quote unquote, it's more economically productive to have immigrants, you could subjectively value non-immigrants more. But he doesn't give the same benefit of the doubt to tariffs, which I don't know if he doesn't want to step any libertarian toes, or that's a line even he can't cross in his own brain.
He didn't think
the way
about
I saw it was just private property is above everything. Private property is the most important thing. So when it comes to immigration, it's basic. His gripe with it in a state context is, I, as a private property owner, don't get to choose whether someone interacts with my property or not, because basically the government decides whether they can enter the government's jurisdiction or not, builds infrastructure that allows this person to come to my front door. Whereas for, I guess, his private property argument is, I, as the owner, should be the one to decide who interacts with my property or not. And I guess from the perspective of tariffs too, my guess is he'd say, basically, as the one trading with others, if I want to set tariffs on anyone interacting with me contractually, that's my problem. I can do that if I really want. The way I reckon the key to Hoppe is basically private property autistically is just above everything. It's the ground.
Yeah, it reigns supreme even over his boomer racism. That's how strong our property is.
That's called being principled.
Not even the most racist Austrian monarchist can defeat private property.
I don't see him ever being able to find mainstream appeal, even though some of his thoughts are interesting. But obviously some of the things that he either explains or advocates or whatever is just
so abrasive to a lot of people that they're probably just like wouldn't even engage with some of his other thoughts, which are actually interesting. They're just like, well, no.
Well, in a lot of ways, they're designed to be anti-mimetic, or at least anti-macro-mimetic, right? The abrasion is the point. It's supposed to. The whole point is that so it doesn't get co-opted or hijacked by cultural hegemons or the cathedral or whatever. It's supposed to be completely takeover proof. You can't mind control Hoppe, right? It's that's why he's like hyper discrimination. Discrimination is what the state hates most is discrimination, be it economic or any form of discrimination. So therefore, I'll put discrimination as my highest virtue. It's almost like an immune system. It's a mimetic immune system when he says discrimination is a virtue, or to a certain degree. So. And the thing is, even though it's not macro-mimetic, it's micro-mimetic. And so people who are deeply already prone to this belief. So if you, with Hoppe, you can't say, I agree with some of Hoppe's stuff. The way he argues and the way he basically comes as a package deal because it's so niche and because it's so strong. He does not water down his liquor at all in this case. You have to take it all, basically. Or in Yarvin's case, even, Hoppe goes straight to the corner of libertarianism. In Yarvin just breaks the frame and just says, you know what, I'm going to keep a lot of my libertarian priors, but at the end of the day, I'm going to say the state is above property at the end of the day. And that's where Yarvin leaves Hoppe, and there's where mutations of Hoppe's ideas are popular or have some effect in the world, at least in America today. I mean, the internet right or e-right's basically all mutations of Hoppe at this point. So it's pure Hoppe, yeah, no, but mutations of Hoppe or adaptations of Hoppe are in the world today, I'd say.
Nice. So so did you want to say something, Jack?
I was just going to say, do you want to talk about private defense?
Before we get into private defense, I wanted to talk about personal secession. So in one of the chapters, he talks about like delegitimization of democracy. So Rothbard makes an argument that at some level, even in a totalitarian autocracy, in order to maintain power, the regime needs either the assent or the passivity of the majority of the population, at the very least. And so they manufacture consent through, like the media, through academia, and so forth. And the population, at the end of the day, still could overthrow any particular regime, in part by delegitimizing the ethical foundations of the rulers. One of the some of the consequences, according to Popper, of our system of democracy is people are incentivized to go into government because we have a quote unquote free government entry. So if the government is an organization that is able to take other people's wealth from the haves and give it to the have-nots, then people are incentivized to get into the government to try to benefit from that dynamic and then buy votes and take money off the have-nots, off the haves and give it to have-nots to buy votes, and all these other sort of perverse incentives. And he asks well, you as an individual living in one of these systems, what should you do? And then he talks about personal secession. And he asks, he says, here's some of the things that you can do. And he says, which I found really funny. I'll read them out quickly. He says, you should disregard the central government and regard it as illegitimate and treat it and its agents as an outlaw foreign occupying force. Only comply with them out of self-preservation if you have to, but don't do anything that helps them or supports them or facilitates their operations. Give them as little money and property through taxation as possible. Regard federal law and regulation as null and void and ignore it whenever possible. Do not work or volunteer for them, especially the executive and the judicial branches and so forth. And don't even associate with anybody.
That was the funniest. Just got no contact,
especially if they're involved with the leadership. do not participate in central government policies, do not contribute to the operation of the federal government political machinery, and do not contribute or participate in any institutions, agencies, foundations, organizations, institutions, or think tanks cooperating with or funded by any central government, and withhold as much property from the state as possible. And then he says there's a two-part defense investment strategy against this regime. One defensive measure, like defensive measures and offensive measures. And the defensive measures are protect yourself against theft from the government by investing in things that conceal, hide, or withdraw your wealth from the eyes and arms of the government. And your offensive measures are to actively engage and contribute to campaigns of delegitimization against the government. I was like, so that's your individual personal secession before you've like formed a separatist movement within your jurisdiction.
Can you imagine being Hoppe's grandkid? You're like, hey, Grandpa Hoppe, do you have any advice for me this Thanksgiving? Can you imagine this? Can you imagine this man as your grandfather? He's either like the worst grandpa ever or the best grandpa ever. It's no in between. It depends if you inherit the autism.
I just love that he just went like, he's just like, just fuck with them every week. just don't play fucking ball. I wonder how many people are actually doing this.
Well, technically speaking, by even engaging in Bitcoin, this is a landing idea of hyperstition. By you believing in Bitcoin as virulently as you do, and by engaging in Bitcoin, like you even said blatantly, in a certain degree, you committed a mimetic terrorism with the state, saying, there's this great line from you, Levi, where you said, the $100 in your pocket is basically literally rotting with each coming second. It's worth less and less.
Well, it is.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're saying something that's fundamentally delegitimizes the state. If
the truth delegitimizes the state, then the state is not legitimate.
Exactly, right? Exactly. That's what Hoppe is saying fundamentally. By you even participating in Bitcoin being 100K is 100% terrifying, right? Because it's the reverse of like the whole concept of Bayesian Briars. All the Bitcoin haters, Bitcoin's worthless. It'll never hit 10,000. Hits 10,000. Oh, this crash is going to kill Bitcoin. Bitcoin is internal. It can never die at this point. Fundamentally, the potentiality of Bitcoin is always there. Right.
Yeah.
So even in something as small as donating or putting your money into Bitcoin or even Dogecoin, even a shit coin in some ways is better than fiat currency. As long as you believe in it to a certain degree. Even something like that is basically what he would say is a revolutionary act.
Yeah. All I have to say to those people is that you buy at the price you deserve.
All these Johnny come ladies, all these tourists.
Yeah, have fun when it's 10 million.
When it's 21 million divided by, or when it's infinity divided by 21 million.
Have funny when the currencies collapse and you don't have a choice. So, yeah, nah, fuck him. So did you want to talk about defense, Jack? Did you want to give us
the way he talks about defense? Because it's a common criticism of, I guess libertarianism exists on a spectrum, but the criticism of more extreme forms of libertarianism is basically that of how do you produce safety. And Hoppe, one, just disagrees with, say, the Hobbesian notion of the state of nature being a war of all against all. He says you do get production of security in such a state. But then he says, okay, how would people in Ancapistan defend themselves? Well, they would buy protection services. And because protection services are being offered on a free market, a free and competitive market, they're going to be better value than any provided by a state. Then he says which organizations which currently exist would be most effective at providing these defensive services. And he says, okay, well, what is security? Well, it's basically insurance. You're paying for a security service so that in a crisis you can have some sort of defensive insurance. So therefore, insurance companies are the best place to be providing defensive services. And from this, because Hopper, everything's interconnected and he pushes everything quite far. And he says, okay, well, what's this going to look like? So you might have entire communities that are all defended by the one insurance company. And because insurance companies are naturally worried about risk, what are they going to be considering? Okay, well, they're going to be considering the location of the people they're insuring and the behavior of people they're insuring. So they're basically, as part of their policy, going to be demanding certain behavior. So suppose you border a state and you've signed up to some particular insurer. They're basically going to demand that everyone bordering that state forms a militia and trains in a certain way. They might provide weapons. They're going to basically demand a certain level of readiness. They're also going to demand, say, that you're not going to be aggressive, because that could result in them having to pay out money if you're picking fights with people around you, or maybe they just won't insure you. So I like that not only does he say, okay, well, multinational insurers are going to be the ones providing security, but he, from that, I think reasonably makes the observation that if these insurers are not constrained in how they sell their policies or how they calculate premiums and so on, they're going to end up demanding certain social behaviors as well of policyholders. He says this is going to lead to a lot of peace. I'm not convinced that these organizations wouldn't just go to war with each other, but that's just one of my priors, that people are going to find a reason to fight with each other. What, Levi and Gabe, what do you think of basically insurers having control over even more of your lives?
I would say that he basically just, reinvented government from first principles, basically.
Yeah, this sounds a lot like government, because once an insurer is strong enough and controls enough territory, then it's beginning to sound a lot like a new government.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I mean, the Mannerbund, the Brotherhood of Soldiers, is the oldest political body in the world. You know what I mean? It's I'm with Moldbug and Schmidt on this. At this point, whoever has a monopoly on violence is the state. If you're in Mexico, it's the cartel. It's not the police officer. You know what I mean? If you're in Russia, it's whoever has a gun and you can bribe with $20. You know what I mean? It's that simple. At the end of the day, whoever can threaten to kill you and kill you without getting punished is your boss. At the end of the day, it's just pure realpolitik. In this case, you're replacing the state with a more effective version of the state at the very least.
Yeah,
a more invasive state.
Somebody said so there's two things. Somebody said something along the lines of if you want to know who rules over you, ask who you can't make fun of. Who you can't make jokes about.
Levi said that.
Yeah, you can't make fun of Levi. That's in Tasmania. No, but the probably it sounds very much like the world of Snow Crash. Do you know Snow Crash? Who's Snow Crash written by?
Stevenson.
Yeah, Neil Stevenson, where it's like the United States of America is basically like a shell. No, you get it right. It's like a shell of the government. It doesn't really do anything, and really like the entire landmass of the US has been divided up into these quasi autonomous state-like entities owned and ruled by corporate entities. So it's like the US just been divided into like corporate mini states.
Yeah, and the hot zone.
And since Snow Crash is like a really fucking cool book, I think that would be great if insurance companies just became the new oligarchs and divided up the continental United States into little subzones of insurance protected mini sovereignties. So as long as it sounds really cyberpunk, I'm with it. It's cool.
I did like the part where he's like, okay, how can insurance companies compete with state violence? One, they're way more efficient. Two, they are multinational and really wealthy. And so if a state, say, takes territory from policyholders, they can retaliate against the state with things like assassination campaigns, He keeps bringing up long distance lasers. He keeps saying they could develop lasers and just kill the president with a laser. That can happen. Like, the AXA laser satellite just vaporizes the White House.
It is a fun thought experiment to ask what would be possible if there weren't a state. Like, what would the social order look like, and what organizations and institutions would fulfill the various functions that the state currently fulfills. Like classic example would be like for welfare, the idea is that voluntary civil society organizations such as charities or churches or just, like family and community would fulfill the role of taking care of the needy or whatever. The welfare state is basically like displacing that entire menagerie of civil society institutions. And if you ask, like, well, what are all the different things that the state is doing? How would we fulfill them? I don't know if insurance companies, if you were to if say these the centralized federal governments were to collapse over the course of the next couple of centuries, and we were to replace them with smaller secessionist city states and stuff, would insurance companies fulfill that? I'm not sure. It's the only one that I've heard that sounds reasonable, because insurance companies have an incentive to provide those sorts of services. But I guess it's getting to, and this is my concern about not just Hoppe, but also the latter part of Principles of Economics by Seyfried Ammous and some of the other really speculative libertarian stuff. Is they just start talking about stuff that is so alternative universe in such low resolution that I maybe that was what happened. Maybe there's something really meaningful that you haven't taken into consideration, and that's just that's not what would happen.
I mean, if there were, say, just a disintegration of social order, why wouldn't it be some part of the military that would take control?
Yeah, they already have the guns.
The people who know how to use violence very, very effectively in a group.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you have the beautiful fusion of the private military complex. Yeah.
Private protection agencies.
It's the best of both worlds.
Are there any other major concepts that we've missed out on, or do you think we've covered all the major ones?
I think we've covered most of the major ones. Do you have more to say, Gabe?
Well, I mean, on this point, actually, I would like the idea of the speculative fiction. The part of the interesting thing about first principles thinking, as long as you're true to your prior and to your a priori thought belief, you can literally carry that all the way to some very strange lands. But as soon as you follow the through line,
yeah.
On the assumption that your axioms are not missing anything meaningful.
And as long as you're consistent, and not to bring up Moldbug again, but Moldbug basically takes this idea of the insurance state is okay. It's a pure real political realist. So so insurance state is the new government. All right. So we'll just cut the fat and make the joint stock company as a state now, because you have the CEO. And the problem with shares, because with a joint stock company, at least with shares, the CEO has the incentive to make sure the people who are buying shares get their values in. And the only power that the shareholders have is to get rid of the CEO. If the CEO does a bad job, you can replace them. So there's a feedback mechanism in there, at least implicitly a feedback mechanism of an incentive structure for the CEO. And he also does this for Bitcoin. I highly recommend both of you read this. It's called Bit Zion. Moldbug argues that the only way for Bitcoin to truly succeed is that if Bitcoin becomes the state. Basically, it's a hyper Doge of Venice kind of deal where voting would actually work, because voting kind of works in a joint stock sense, because again, you're actually putting your own incentive, you're buying into your opinions have weight, your opinions have stakes, you have something on the line personally, and everyone else does, and it's clear and it's concise. So it's not dubious like it is in democracies. You know, if you decide to hire a CEO just because you are sexually attracted to them, you like X, Y, and Z biases, if you don't hire on competence, you lose money. You will lose out on you hire a bad CEO and everyone loses their money. So you get punished for misaligned incentives, and of course the stakes are high because the highest stake possible is the government structure. So you get Moldbug, being a maximalist, is saying fundamentally with currency there can only be one true currency. You know what I mean? You know, Ethereum, all these dog coins, you know, they had to be absorbed. You know, so he's basically saying Bitcoin must absorb all other cryptocurrencies and basically become a neo merchant republic, basically. And the thing is, whoever has the most shares of Bitcoin can decide who's the CEO or who is the Doge in Venice's case. And so
Grand Doge.
yeah, so you can't have voting. You can't have voting as long as you're voting for an absolute CEO dictator powered by Bitcoin. So that's one little neat aspect that Moldbug takes from this and just runs with it. Like, because you can see the radicalizing evolution. Rothbard's already radical. Hoppe further. Yarvin even fucking further. Right, and so that, and this is a cool thing. As long as you can, I like kind of ideological genealogies and so forth. So if you go all the way to the foundation principle of, let's say, Rothbard, you can actually make sense of all these digressions. Even though all three of these men disagree with others on certain points, that one through line carries through all three men. So that's one cool thing about first priori thinking and first principles thinking, in contrast to cringe empiricist thought.
So we've got our standard questions when we round out these episodes, one of which is, would we recommend this book? I would. I think it's really, really fun. It's a sort of book where if you disagree even slightly with any of the first principles, because he's so rigid a first principles thinker, the further he pushes those, the less you're going to agree with him. But it's really enjoyable for similar reasons that The Accursed Share by Bataille is enjoyable, in that both of them pick a few things that are just true, like Bataille's ideas of energy accumulation and expenditure, or private property for Hoppe, and they just push them and write quite clearly and take you to some really wacky places. It's really fun in that regard. If people are interested in understanding the internet right, this book unlocks a lot of that, or I think clarifies a lot of where that's coming from. So, and it's not that long. It's not a particularly difficult read because he writes clearly and he's very systematic. So I'd recommend this one.
I think, well, we talked about this for 5 hours. I would say, at the end of the day, is it worth 5 hour discussion? Yes, it is. Is it worth a buy on that fact alone? Absolutely. I like I said, either for cultural anthropology reasons, as a historical document, it's extremely interesting. As a lot of the reasons why I read that now was to discuss it not only as a first time reader, but also as a second time reader, and see how its effective world has grown. But fundamentally, it is in a lot of ways, thinkers like this can teach you how to think. I think. Well, you know what I mean. It makes you investigate your prior beliefs, how you view the world, and how ideas can evolve and how ideas can interact with other concepts. Because, like you said, 90% of people who recommend this book are just like, they just don't like democracy. It's like, oh, this debunks democracy. They don't care about the private property parts. They don't care anything about the, praxeology. They just want something to debunk the libtards. And, libertarians think smart, and they need someone with high IQ and high firepower to do it. And libertarians are the best ones at that, to be honest with you. And so, but, even for sincere intellectual stimulation, I would absolutely recommend this book.
Yeah, nice. I would say it's worth reading if you if you're interested in Austrian economics and you've got the basics down and you want to see somebody apply it to the extreme and see where some of the consequences go. You might disagree with him again about some of his basics. I've got a number of disagreements with him, but in terms of somebody taking those ideas seriously and sincerely, and then trying to see like what's the actual consequence of them. It's a really interesting exploration. It's also useful if you want to understand a very obscure part of either, like, I suppose, the internet, right, and or a very niche part of the Bitcoin online community, and try to understand a book that's, or like try to understand their perspective by reading a book that is very influential in those spheres. I would say that we highlighted a couple of like issues with it, like for example, like the natural law thing, and that seeming like an article of faith, basically. I've got a couple of other issues with it, but like for the most part, it's a really interesting exploration. And I think, I guess my next question would be for both of you, like what have you gotten out of it, or what impact has it had on your thinking, if any?
You want to go first, Gabe?
Well, actually, this is your first time. I'm actually curious. We're popping your monarchical cherry here. So as the person living on occupied Habsburg lands, I think you need to justify yourself now. This is your either or. You have to make a choice now.
In terms of things I learned from this, it's really just reinforcing ultimately the problems I have with libertarianism, and because he puts it in such a pure form, those problems are made more obvious, in that I think most libertarians and anarcho-capitalists don't seriously contend with the problem of violence and how to prevent violence, and I don't think Hoppe really does so. And then the fundamental problem of natural law, in that perhaps natural law does exist, and it exists in the way that, for example, Hoppe says it does, but just need to give a bit more evidence as to why free exchange is natural and a reflection of the natural order, but something like violence isn't, even though I would say violence is just as ubiquitous as voluntary exchange, if not more. So I think what I learned from this book was really clarifications of libertarianism, because this book is almost a crystallization of libertarianism. It just purifies and pushes it to its limit.
Yeah, it's the outermost right corner, or the bottom right corner, I guess, on the political compass of libertarianism. It is its purest form. You read this, Human Action, and like Theory of Money and Credit, and you basically have the foundations of libertarian thought. And of course, fiat food. We can't forget the wonderful fiat food.
Yeah, can't forget fiat.
Right. Well, like I said, what I got out of this today was an interesting trip down nostalgia lane. I have the wonderful mimetic effects of Hoppe, but seeing, where all these ideologies of today, going back to the root of it, back when the red pill was still fresh. You'd still feel you feel that first sizzle that on your tongue. You feel your toes curl. It hits you right.
Chasing that high for the rest of your life.
Yeah, basically.
I unironically think that's why people keep getting more extreme, is because they're chasing that feeling of uncovering some sort of truth, which is why they get into really dumb areas, because once you've gotten the big stuff out of the way, you kind of just start making stuff up in order to feel that sense of discovery again.
Yeah. Like if you tune your instrument the wrong way, you're communicating with demons.
And what was the difference between when you first read it, Gabe, and the second time you've read it now? Like, can you sense what was the difference in the experience?
Well, with the first one, I felt like, of course, it's the classic thing of you read something outside the outer window and like, oh my God, this explains everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're one of the chosen few.
Yes. Oh my God, I'm so big brain, man. I can. My mom doesn't even know what an anarcho-capitalist means. That must be like I'm on
like,
something.
The state is modern slavery.
You could tell I was very much, a fun or a nuisance on family meetings and family dinners when I first read this book. But no, sincerely, like, I still appreciate that, again, that rush factor, that not necessarily a taboo, because it's just, the raw feeling of, oh my God, this is so outside of what I'm used to. And you can tell it's not bullshit. You can tell Hoppe is 100% believes this is real, this is natural, this is right, capital R, right. And it's same thing with Nietzsche. Nietzsche is 100% confident in his assertions. And it's not, when I grew up, the idea of compromise and debate at 50-50, oh, it could be this or it could be not, seeing people with such a conviction of their values, it's refreshing, honestly. It was really, really a rush. And seeing it now, it was much more of, reviewing of, playing a video game you memorize front to back and discovering all the mechanical secrets of that video game and how the level was designed and all these kind of things. I view it more as a historical document now, but the first time it really was a vision to the future that is now my present. So it was a treat in both regards.
Yeah, nice. Nice. I feel like this stuff has had a really significant impact on me. Like, one of the key things that they highlight is I feel like it's obvious once you think about it, but if you don't think about it, maybe it's not so obvious. It's just at the end of the day, the government's got to get its money from somewhere, and in a progressive taxation system like Australia, it's essentially like the more productive you are, as indicated by being paid more by the market, the more heavily taxed you are. And so actually the most productive people in society are being taxed the heaviest, at least when it comes to income tax. I know if there's ways to get around that if you're like, I don't know, like very asset rich or something. But so it creates this kind of conflict where it's like, okay, well, I want to live in a society where like wealth creation is prioritized and valued because that raises the material living standards of everybody and makes the world more peaceful and encourages like people to be civil and polite and all that sort of stuff and think long term. And yet we're actively punishing people for being highly productive, thinking long term, working hard, and then giving it to an institution which has at best questionable efficiency when it comes to utilizing their resources, and at worst they're actively like incentivized to be as inefficient as possible, and so that's given me pause. And in particular, when I'm currently like looking at different jobs and stuff to apply for, and I look through a bunch of government jobs and I'm like, do I really want to apply for a government job? Like, is that, or am I actually going to like take seriously some of what the ethics of what these people are saying? And so it's like, okay, to the best of my ability, if I can avoid being on welfare or taking a government job and just work in an industry job, would that actually be like, maybe it's harder or something, whatever. But actually the benefits of that would be like, well, I feel as though I'm in that part of society that is positive sum and producing a net benefit and so forth. Whereas if I don't, then, and I actually like take seriously these ideas, then I'd have to like be like, okay, I'm going to work today and I'm going to be paid by somebody else at some point down the line who has had their property rights violated in order to pay my salary. And there's no price mechanism or economic calculation to tell me whether or not my labor is actually producing something good for society. And so it's had a meaningful impact on the way that I'm thinking through like real life decisions. And I guess for what it's worth, that's, even if I don't agree with everything that somebody like Hoppe is saying, it's informed the way that I'm trying to like live my life on an ethical level, I suppose, which is powerful, I guess.
Well, a good question I ask you is, I know another foundational thinker for you, Levi, is Karl Popper, right? The Open Society. And I think overall, especially with the Open Society, or considering the Open Society by Karl Popper, or Karl Poppian ethics or so forth, or Hoppe, is that the foundational choice between, like, I would actually pose a question to both of y'all, is like, we all know the civilizational decay of high time preference, and also in regards to money. So I would like to pose, fundamentally a question for both of y'all is, would you rather have an authoritarian society that's not an open society, but at least you would know would survive till at least your great-grandchildren, or an open society that will fundamentally will resolve in a high time preference chaos, reflected both in economic terms and also literally physical violence terms?
The thing is, so there's so much variation within open societies and authoritarian societies that just having the either or in that way is, like, I guess my answer would be it really, really depends. If it is just purely arbitrarily limited to you have an open society that is going to blow apart in your lifetime, or an authoritarian society that is stable, I pick stability. Like, ultimately, I'd pick stability over basically anything. But with the huge caveat that outside of the confines of an arbitrarily restricted question, there are so many more stations between like a completely open society and an authoritarian society. Like, it's just a completely closed off society.
And the self-defense insurance state, basically. There's a little more.
Yeah. I guess it's useful to distinguish between like the three things that Hopper is saying. He's saying, like, okay, you have no state, so a free law society with, pure capitalism or whatever, anarcho-capitalism, in which you have these insurance protection companies and private defense and all that sort of stuff. He might argue that is actually the maximally open form of society, and that in fact that's the most, in that society you actually have the maximum amount of people being able to do what they want, and as he says in one of the chapters, a maximum amount of diversity. Again, we haven't had the actual experiment run to see if that is the case, if a society that gets rid of the state and has that sort of structure, social order, if that is in fact what does happen, despite his theory. With that caveat, of the two other choices he theorizes, monarchy, private ownership of public goods, and democracy, public ownership of public goods, I think the main issue with monarchy or any sort of authoritarianism, where like under Popper's conception, the defining characteristic of democracy is not like the specific mechanism, like is it first past the post, is it like proportional representation or whatever. Those are just particular mechanisms of implementing the fundamental idea of being able to peacefully remove the wrong rulers rather than choose the right rulers. And that idea is the fundamental idea. And in a democracy, even though you have public ownership of public goods, as long as that mechanism to peacefully remove bad rulers and stuff, you can still have error correction and problem solving. And it might not be as efficient as we like, but there's still the option. Whereas if you have a monarchy, like the actual historical, like Popper's theory sounds nice and stuff, and then I just have to cite things like the Iranian royal family before the 76 revolution, or Caligula, the Roman emperor, who had an incredibly high time preference, bankrupted the society, and was completely authoritarian, or obviously people like Benito Mussolini, and it would just go down the line of like individuals who counterpoint to the current Monaco royal family or the current dictatorship of Singapore, actually completely had incredibly high time preferences and destroyed their society. And so under autocracy of its various forms, or monarchy of its various forms, even though you might have some stability in the short term, you have an incredible amount of fragility, which is within the succession plan or within the lifetime of a single ruler. The society is betting that they're not going to become completely malicious, completely power hungry, completely like high time preference, and all the theory that Hoppe brings up ignores the fact that like people there's historical examples like Caligula of people who like had every reason to invest in the long-term capital accumulation of society because it would increase the value of their property and stuff, and they just destroyed it. And like they didn't like it's like it actually doesn't stack up to there's specific concrete examples of like autocrats who didn't take into consideration the stuff that Hoppe was saying. And so under an open society where the ruled have the ability to remove bad rulers and change bad rules, even though in practice it's at times inefficient and it's error prone and it's slow and we sometimes feel like we're going backwards and so forth, there is still problem solving going on. And importantly, there's still critical analysis and discussion and criticism of our institutions that allows like democracies to all of the specific problems that Hoppe like outlaid in Democracy, the God That Failed. He claims that these are an inherent part of the structure. They're like, it's a part of the internal logic of democracy. And that's like an axiom that I just don't think it's it's internally necessary part of the logic of democracy. I think like if the people in like Australia or whatever in reality realize that this is a problem, that the degree of like private property violation is causing like, the impoverishment of Australia, people can be educated, people can change their minds, people can then, after changing their minds, vote for changes in policy, changes in rulers, and can actually affect for those errors that we have in our system to be corrected. Whereas under autocratic rule, it's not clear to me that you're basically like taking a huge bet that the current ruler and all subsequent successors will continue to error correct appropriately, and we're people, like they're people. I think that they're going to make mistakes just like everybody else. So when it comes to like actually that sort of question, I have to just like bring it back to error correction and problem solving, and whether or not like the structure of the institution in the long term actually allows ongoing problem solving for society. And I'm not convinced that Hoppe actually has solved that problem within his framework. He kind of just assumes, based on like quote unquote praxeological logic, that these things will sort themselves out. And I think that's a bit of a leap of faith again.
He totally banks on exit, on being able to leave.
Yeah, but having said that, I do think that one of his most important contributions in this particular book, and probably in his other work, is that promoting the idea of exit is really important. And I think in order for democracy to function, as I just said, these barriers to exit are actually inhibiting our free society's ability to engage in error correction and criticism and stuff, because that's a really important form of criticism. It's like, I have such little confidence in our democracy. My vote of no confidence goes so far as I'm just going to emigrate. Does that answer your question? Sorry, that was a bit of a long response.
No, I guess neither of us totally answered the question, because we both either bent it or interpreted it very literally with a bunch of qualifications.
Yeah, a bunch of sorry. Yeah, Gabe, did we answer your question? Sorry.
No, that was fantastic. I think that was extremely well thought out and well planned out. Especially with the criteria as I gave. I tried to make it as binary as possible, because I know Hoppe means a lot to both of y'all, the open society and so forth. Though I was very curious to see, would Dr. Hoppe or Mr. Hoppe would win out in this. And that was fantastic.
I think like any. And it's surprisingly rare, as in Hoppe and David Deutsch are the only people who I've seen take this idea seriously, and they're like the group of people who subsequently, like in places like Oxford, have gone like, oh, we really take Popper's ideas seriously. Let's think about how this impacts education or whatever. any philosophy, whether it's political or moral or whatever, that doesn't actively engage in the idea of problem solving and error correction, as in the idea that to err is human, and that one of the most important functions of a society that makes progress is that it has to be able to error correct peacefully. Any treatise or book that doesn't address that specifically, I immediately just think, okay, the author here hasn't actually like thought through the issue of errors in being a person. Like, that's just a perennial part of being a person.
I guess my hope with democracy, and ultimately I guess it might be an assumption of the open society, is that good decisions are ultimately a selection criterion for gaining power, and that's kind of just something I hope.
The only other major issue that I have with the book is I guess I'd like if you guys have any other major issues, but the only other major issue I have is like I can't really put this into words. It's just a gut feeling that reducing everything to private property and private property rights, and it feels extremely reductionist. And I'm just thinking, like,
yeah, it's because
surely there are other like yes, it's important. Yeah, I'm not saying it's not important, but like, there's nothing else to consider in the matrix of possible interactions between the various values and ethical considerations of a person or a society. It's just property rights. So do you guys, I can't put it any more accurately than that, other than to say my spidey senses are tingling on that one.
So I guess this is part of why one of the reasons why I really enjoyed the book, because I often approach these things from a more aesthetic perspective than you do, in that I enjoy if someone is just completely reductive. It's like, yeah, I only give a shit about property rights. Let me push this as far as I can. I enjoy seeing what happens. Does it mean that I'm going to take this as a completely accurate map of reality? No, because I think there are probably more things influencing the world or human behavior than private property. But I mean, it made me enjoy the book more, actually, than if he were a bit more subtle. Like, this is a profoundly unsubtle book.
Yeah, nuance takes away from the quality of the book. What about you, Gabe? Did you have any other, especially in your old age now, the second time reading, what's your major considerations?
As a much older man, as a member of, as a person who got radicalized by the Book from Hell, as a proper Evolian traditionalist, I found the lack of my rotating lunar harems rather disturbing. Yeah. But that actually is a sincere criticism of the Evolian part of HRX. This is how hard the blogosphere. This is how crippling autistic the blogosphere was. There was a big schism in the NRX community because the hyper traditional guys, people who read Democracy That Got That Failed, but like the monarchy part, and it was like, okay, I want the woo woo, I want the spirituality, I want the king is actually a god king. He's not just a mere property owner. The HRX types, the high reaction types, is that fundamentally the problem is
high reaction. I hadn't
yes, that's how crippling autistic the blogosphere was back in the day. The problem with Hoppe is that, again, he would unironically die for his belief in private property rights. It is his spirituality. That is his total theological purpose in life, is the sanctity of private property. Of course, with a lot of people who want to read this, is that it gives a lot of, it gives you rational reasons why you would do X, Y, and Z. But it doesn't give you something to die for, at least unless you're crippling autistically libertarian like him. In a lot of ways, the whole point of a philosophy or a belief system is, would I die for an X belief system? And I don't think total devotion to private property is that convincing to a large segment of people. That's my biggest criticism, is that would I prefer to live in Hoppe land? Absolutely. I mean, I am, Jack is partly like white pilled. You're white pilled to the open society. I am like, nope. I fundamentally am paranoid about democracy. I fundamentally see it. I am a Schmitty, and I see democracy as a cold civil war at all times. So I'd much rather prefer bright red lines. I pay my purpose. Everyone has, revealed preference for each other. I'd much rather have a nice binary video game like structure where the rules are clear. But I would admit that I would, as a person who's agnostic at least, but I would like to see it something more than private property being valued as the highest ideal possible.
Yeah, like.
Not much
Maybe
thumos in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe the deification of the earth or something like that. I mean, you can the Gaia, just become a Gaian.
Well, at least in Atlas Shrugged, at least we get the heroic figure of John Galt. Who's, let's be honest, he basically is like a Greek demigod in that fucking book.
Ayn Rand, I don't think she's given enough credit for. Of course, she's got the cold-blooded private property aspect, but the intense eros in all of her novels,
that is true,
is not commented on enough.
She was a sex kitten. She was an e-girl. She was one of the first e-girls.
Yeah, she really was.
She really should have been.
She was.
Now.
She definitely was fin-doming the fuck out of Rothbard. I guess. Hey, Gabe, did you want to mention again, just at the end of the episode, like where our listeners can find your stuff and anywhere that you'd like to direct them?
Well, I will personally invite you to our private property kingdom of Tookie's Mag. We have highly selective proposition of joining Tookie's Mag. Though we have some of the top tuggers, our toughest tuggers, over here at Tookie's Mag, and fundamentally we focus more on. We're much more cultural. I'm not sure. I put on my serious hat here. I actually am very interested in critical theory and theory of politics and so forth. But over there, I tend to let loose and be much more jovial, I guess you could say.
AI girlfriends.
AI girlfriends, yes, exactly. And that's the other failure of the welfare state, is the AI girlfriend situation. Hoppe does not have the answer to the total fertility collapse of AI girlfriends.
Is the problem that there's not enough AI girlfriends? We need more. 10 AI girlfriends. A lunar rotating harem,
and it's not even to
AI
meet
girlfriends.
Like market demands or anything like that. It's just purely so that you have more AI girlfriends. That's the end in itself.
Well, it becomes a commodity that transcends marginal analysis because it's so abundant, like air, that it shouldn't be priced. We should just have infinite amounts of AI girlfriends for everyone.
It's unpriced. It's just a medium. It's an ontological medium.
And when the last human dies, what that movie about the fertility collapse? No Country, not Country for Old Men. So there's this Children of Man. When the last human dies. Since it's basically mimetic sterilization, you just have the Earth empty of life except all these hologram girls.
But then they can form a society.
Yeah, the rise of
then they can form Ancapistan.
The rise of AI girlfriends might accelerate the population collapse. But yeah, then we'll just be transcended by a superior race of virtual e-girls with their own Ancapistan, which will be really great.
We finally get
a free country,
an AI accelerationist female techno ethno state. We finally get the matriarchy, techno matriarchy.
Techno matriarchy. Oh fuck, grim. Okay, well, I don't have anything else to add other than thanks for listening, and also thanks, Gabe,
thanks so much for coming on.
And sticking around
almost 4 hours.
Almost 4 hours. It must be nearly 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock where you are. So thank you so much for.
That's brutal.
No, it's fantastic.
Staying up with us.
It's fantastic. I prepped for this. I hope I gave y'all some good content. This was a fantastic time for me and an honor to be on this pod.
Yeah, it was really fun to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much. This won't be released until the new year, so Happy New Year, everybody. And shout out to everybody from the Book Club from Hell community who who have had us as their 2024 one of their top podcasts. That's fucking dope. Thanks for supporting us.
And no one had no one had Tookie's Mag as their top podcast, by the way, on their Spotify.
Come on, go support Tookie's Mag. Give him a fucking 5-star rating, you motherfuckers.
I actually give us 5 stars too. I keep forgetting to say that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But, there will be consequences there will be a tough tugging for our tuggers tonight, for all the ones who didn't vote for us and their Spotify Wrapped.
And get Jack's book at onlyfans.com/JackBC.
Yeah, that's the place.
All right, thank you.
Right. Thanks for listening.
All right. Good night, everyone.